The Woman in White by Wilkie. Part 12. The story continued by Mrs. Catherick. Sr. You have not come back, as you said you would. No matter, I know the news, and I write to tell you so. Did you see anything particular in my face when you left me? I was wondering, in my own mind, whether the day of his downfall had come at last, and whether you were the chosen instrument for working it. You were, and you have worked it. You were weak enough, as I have heard, to try and save his life. If you had succeeded, I should have looked upon you as my enemy. Now you have failed, I hold you as my friend. Your inquiries frightened him into the vestry by night. Your inquiries, without your privity and against your will, have served the hatred and wreaked the vengeance of 23 years. Thank you, sir, in spite of yourself. I owe something to the man who has done this. How can I pay my debt? If I was a young woman still, I might say, "Come, put your arm round my waist and kiss me if you like." I should have been fond enough of you even to go that length, and you would have accepted my invitation. You would, sir, 20 years ago. But I'm an old woman now. Well, I can satisfy your curiosity and pay my debt in that way. You had a great curiosity to know certain private affairs of mine when you came to see me. Private affairs which all your sharpness could not look into without my help. Private affairs which you have not discovered. Even now, you shall discover them. Your curiosity shall be satisfied. I will take any trouble to please you, my estimable young friend. You were a little boy, I suppose, in the year 27? I was a handsome young woman at that time, living at Old Welmingham. I had a contemptible fool for a husband. I had also the honor of being acquainted, never mind how, with a certain gentleman, never mind whom. I shall not call him by his name. Why should I? It was not his own. He never had a name. You know that by this time, as well as I do. It will be more to the purpose to tell you how he worked himself into my good graces. I was born with the tastes of a lady, and he gratified them. In other words, he admired me, and he made me presents. No woman can resist admiration and presents, especially presents, provided they happen to be just the thing she wants. He was sharp enough to know that most men are. Naturally, he wanted something in return. All men do. And what do you think was the something? The merest trifle. Nothing but the key of the vestry, and the key of the press inside it, when my husband's back was turned. Of course he lied when I asked him why he wished me to get him the keys in that private way. He might have saved himself the trouble. I didn't believe him. But I liked my presents, and I wanted more. So I got him the keys, without my husband's knowledge, and I watched him, without his own knowledge. Once, twice, for times I watched him, and the fourth time I found him out. I was never over-scrupulous where other people's affairs were concerned, and I was not over-scrupulous about his adding one to the marriages in the register on his own account. Of course I knew it was wrong, but it did no harm to me, which was one good reason for not making a fuss about it. And I had not got a gold watch and chain, which was another still better, and he had promised me one from London only the day before, which was a third best of all. If I had known what the law considered the crime to be, and how the law punished it, I should have taken proper care of myself, and have exposed him then and there. But I knew nothing, and I longed for the gold watch. All the conditions I insisted on were that he should take me into his confidence, and tell me everything. I was as curious about his affairs then as you are about mine now. He granted my conditions. Why? You will see presently. This, put in short, is what I heard from him. He did not willingly tell me all that I tell you here. I drew some of it from him by persuasion, and some of it by questions. I was determined to have all the truth, and I believe I got it. He knew no more than anyone else of what the state of things really was between his father and mother till after his mother's death. Then his father confessed it, and promised to do what he could for his son. He died having done nothing, not having even made a will. The son, who can blame him, wisely provided for himself. He came to England at once and took possession of the property. There was no one to suspect him, and no one to say him nay. His father and mother had always lived as man and wife. None of the few people who were acquainted with them ever supposed them to be anything else. The right person to claim the property, if the truth had been known, was a distant relation who had no idea of ever getting it, and who was away at sea when his father died. He had no difficulties so far. He took possession as a matter of course. But he could not borrow money on the property as a matter of course. There were two things wanted of him before he could do this. One was a certificate of his birth, and the other was a certificate of his parents' marriage. The certificate of his birth was easily got. He was born abroad, and the certificate was there in due form. The other matter was a difficulty, and that difficulty brought him to Old Welmingham. But for one consideration, he might have gone to Knowlesbury instead. His mother had been living there just before she met with his father, living under her maiden name, the truth being that she was really a married woman, married in Ireland, where her husband had ill-used her and had afterwards gone off with some other person. I give you this fact on good authority. Sir Felix mentioned it to his son as the reason why he had not married. You may wonder why the son, knowing that his parents had met each other at Knowlesbury, did not play his first tricks with the register of that church, where it might have been fairly presumed his father and mother were married. The reason was that the clergyman who did duty at Knowlesbury Church in the year 1803, when according to his birth certificate his father and mother ought to have been married, was alive still when he took possession of the property in the new year of 1827. This awkward circumstance forced him to extend his inquiries to our neighborhood. There no such danger existed, the former clergyman at our church having been dead for some years. Old Welmingham suited his purpose as well as Knowlesbury. His father had removed his mother from Knowlesbury and had lived with her at a cottage on the river, a little distance from our village. People who had known his solitary ways when he was single did not wonder at his solitary ways when he was supposed to be married. If he had not been a hideous creature to look at, his retired life with the lady might have raised suspicions. But as things were, his hiding his ugliness and his deformity in the strictest privacy surprised nobody. He lived in our neighborhood till he came in possession of the park. After 3 or 4 and 20 years had passed, who was to say, the clergyman being dead, that his marriage had not been as private as the rest of his life, and that it had not taken place at Old Welmingham Church? So, as I told you, the son found our neighborhood the surest place he could choose to set things right secretly in his own interests. It may surprise you to hear that what he really did to the marriage register was done on the spur of the moment, done on second thoughts. His first notion was only to tear the leaf out, in the right year and month, to destroy it privately, to go back to London, and to tell the lawyers to get him the necessary certificate of his father's marriage, innocently referring them, of course, to the date on the leaf that was gone. Nobody could say his father and mother had not been married after that, and whether, under the circumstances, they would stretch a point or not about lending him the money he thought they would. He had his answer ready at all events, if a question was ever raised about his right to the name and the estate. But when he came to look privately at the register for himself, he found at the bottom of one of the pages for the year 1803 a blank space left, seemingly through there being no room to make a long entry there, which was made instead at the top of the next page. The sight of this chance altered all his plans. It was an opportunity he had never hoped for or thought of, and he took it, you know how. The blank space, to have exactly tallied with his birth certificate, ought to have occurred in the July part of the register. It occurred in the September part instead. However, in this case, if suspicious questions were asked, the answer was not hard to find. He had only to describe himself as a 7-month child. I was fool enough, when he told me his story, to feel some interest and some pity for him, which was just what he calculated on, as you will see. I thought him hardly used. It was not his fault that his father and mother were not married, and it was not his father's and mother's fault either. A more scrupulous woman than I was, a woman who had not set her heart on a gold watch and chain, would have found some excuses for him. At all events, I held my tongue and helped to screen what he was about. He was some time getting the ink the right color, mixing it over and over again in pots and bottles of mine, and some time afterwards in practicing the handwriting. But he succeeded in the end, and made an honest woman of his mother after she was dead in her grave. So far, I don't deny that he behaved honorably enough to myself. He gave me my watch and chain, and spared no expense in buying them. Both were of superior workmanship, and very expensive. I have got them still. The watch goes beautifully. You said the other day that Mrs. Clements had told you everything she knew. In that case, there is no need for me to write about the trumpery scandal by which I was the sufferer. The innocent sufferer, I positively assert. You must know as well as I do what the notion was which my husband took into his head when he found me and my fine gentleman acquaintance meeting each other privately and talking secrets together. But what you don't know is how it ended between that same gentleman and myself. You shall read and see how he behaved to me. The first words I said to him, when I saw the turn things had taken, were, "Do me justice. Clear my character of a stain on it which you know I don't deserve. I don't want you to make a clean breast of it to my husband. Only tell him, on your word of honor as a gentleman, that he is wrong, and that I am not to blame in the way he thinks I am. Do me that justice, at least after all I have done for you." He flatly refused, in so many words. He told me plainly that it was his interest to let my husband and all my neighbors believe the falsehood, because as long as they did so they were quite certain never to suspect the truth. I had a spirit of my own, and I told him they should know the truth from my lips. His reply was short and to the point. If I spoke, I was a lost woman, as certainly as he was a lost man. Yes, it had come to that. He had deceived me about the risk I ran in helping him. He had practiced on my ignorance, he had tempted me with his gifts, he had interested me with his story, and the result of it was that he made me his accomplice. He owned this coolly, and he ended by telling me for the first time what the frightful punishment really was for his offense, and for anyone who helped him to commit it. In those days the law was not so tender-hearted as I hear it is now. Murderers were not the only people liable to be hanged, and women convicts were not treated like ladies in undeserved distress. I confess he frightened me. The mean impostor, the cowardly blackguard. Do you understand now how I hated him? Do you understand why I am taking all this trouble? Thankfully taking it, to gratify the curiosity of the meritorious young gentleman who hunted him down? Well, to go on, he was hardly fool enough to drive me to downright desperation. I was not the sort of woman whom it was quite safe to hunt into a corner. He knew that, and wisely quieted me with proposals for the future. I deserved some reward, he was kind enough to say, for the service I had done him, and some compensation, he was so obliging as to add, for what I had suffered. He was quite willing, generous scoundrel, to make me a handsome yearly allowance, payable quarterly, on 2 conditions. First, I was to hold my tongue, in my own interests as well as in his. Secondly, I was not to stir away from Welmingham without first letting him know, and waiting till I had obtained his permission. In my own neighborhood, no virtuous female friends would tempt me in a dangerous gossiping at the tea-table. In my own neighborhood, he would always know where to find me. A hard condition, that second one, but I accepted it. What else was I to do? I was left helpless, with the prospect of a coming encumbrance in the shape of a child. What else was I to do? Cast myself on the mercy of my runaway idiot of a husband who had raised the scandal against me? I would have died first. Besides, the allowance was a handsome one. I had a better income, a better house over my head, better carpets on my floors, than half the women who turned up the whites of their eyes at the sight of me. The dress of virtue in our parts was cotton print. I had silk. So I accepted the conditions he offered me, and made the best of them, and fought my battle with my respectable neighbors on their own ground, and won it in course of time, as you saw yourself. How I kept his secret and mine, through all the years that have passed from that time to this, and whether my late daughter and ever really crept into my confidence and got the keeping of the secret too, are questions, I dare say, to which you are curious to find an answer. Well, my gratitude refuses you nothing. I will turn to a fresh page and give you the answer immediately. But you must excuse one thing. You must excuse my beginning, Mr. Hartright, with an expression of surprise at the interest which you appear to have felt in my late daughter. It is quite unaccountable to me. If that interest makes you anxious for any particulars of her early life, I must refer you to Mrs. Clements, who knows more of the subject than I do. Pray understand that I do not profess to have been at all overfond of my late daughter. She was a worry to me from first to last, with the additional disadvantage of being always weak in the head. You like candor, and I hope this satisfies you. There is no need to trouble you with many personal particulars relating to those past times. It will be enough to say that I observed the terms of the bargain on my side, and that I enjoyed my comfortable income in return, paid quarterly. Now and then I got away and changed the scene for a short time, always asking leave of my lord and master first, and generally getting it. He was not, as I have already told you, fool enough to drive me too hard, and he could reasonably rely on my holding my tongue for my own sake, if not for his. One of my longest trips away from home was the trip I took to Limerick to nurse a half-sister there, who was dying. She was reported to have saved money, and I thought it as well, in case any accident happened, to stop my allowance, to look after my own interests in that direction. As things turned out, however, my pains were all thrown away, and I got nothing because nothing was to be had. I had taken into the north with me, having my whims and fancies, occasionally about my child, and getting, at such times, jealous of Mrs. Clement's influence over her. I never liked Mrs. Clements. She was a poor, empty-headed, spiritless woman, what you call a born drudge, and I was now and then not averse to plaguing her by taking and away. Not knowing what else to do with my girl while I was nursing in Cumberland, I put her to school at Limerick. The lady of the manor, Mrs. Fairley, a remarkably plain-looking woman who had entrapped one of the handsomest men in England into marrying her, amused me wonderfully by taking a violent fancy to my girl. The consequence was she learnt nothing at school and was petted and spoilt at Limerick House. Among other whims and fancies which they taught her there, they put some nonsense into her head about always wearing white. Hating white and liking colors myself, I determined to take the nonsense out of her head as soon as we got home again. Strange to say, my daughter resolutely resisted me. When she had got a notion once fixed in her mind, she was, like other half-witted people, as obstinate as a mule in keeping it. We quarreled finally, and Mrs. Clements, not liking to see it, I suppose, offered to take and away to live in London with her. I should have said yes, if Mrs. Clements had not sided with my daughter about her dressing herself in white. But being determined she should not dress herself in white, and disliking Mrs. Clements more than ever for taking part against me, I said no, and meant no, and stuck to no. The consequence was my daughter remained with me, and the consequence of that, in its turn, was the first serious quarrel that happened about the secret. The circumstance took place long after the time I have just been writing of. I had been settled for years in the new town, and was steadily living down my bad character and slowly gaining ground among the respectable inhabitants. It helped me forward greatly towards this object to have my daughter with me. Her harmlessness and her fancy for dressing in white excited a certain amount of sympathy. I left off opposing her favorite whim on that account, because some of the sympathy was sure, in course of time, to fall to my share. Some of it did fall. I date my getting a choice of the 2 best sittings to let in the church from that time, and I date the clergyman's first bow from my getting the sittings. Well, being settled in this way, I received a letter one morning from that highly born gentleman, now deceased, in answer to one of mine, warning him, according to agreement, of my wishing to leave the town for a little change of air and scene. The ruffianly side of him must have been uppermost, I suppose, when he got my letter, for he wrote back, refusing me in such abominably insolent language that I lost all command over myself, and abused him, in my daughter's presence, as a low impostor whom I could ruin for life if I chose to open my lips and let out his secret. I said no more about him than that, being brought to my senses as soon as those words had escaped me by the sight of my daughter's face looking eagerly and curiously at mine. I instantly ordered her out of the room until I had composed myself again. My sensations were not pleasant, I can tell you, when I came to reflect on my own folly, and had been more than usually crazy and queer that year, and when I thought of the chance there might be of her repeating my words in the town and mentioning his name in connection with them, if inquisitive people got hold of her, I was finally terrified at the possible consequences. My worst fears for myself, my worst dread of what he might do, led me no farther than this. I was quite unprepared for what really did happen only the next day. On that next day, without any warning to me to expect him, he came to the house. His first words, and the tone in which he spoke them, surly as it was, showed me plainly enough that he had repented already of his insolent answer to my application, and that he had come in a mighty bad temper to try and set matters right again before it was too late. Seeing my daughter in the room with me, I had been afraid to let her out of my sight after what had happened the day before. He ordered her away. They neither of them liked each other, and he vented the ill temper on her which he was afraid to show to me. "Leave us," he said, looking at her over his shoulder. She looked back over her shoulder and waited as if she didn't care to go. "Do you hear?" he roared out. "Leave the room? Speak to me civilly, says she, getting red in the face. Turn the idiot out, says he, looking my way. She had always had crazy notions of her own about her dignity, and that word idiot upset her in a moment. Before I could interfere, she stepped up to him in a fine passion. Beg my pardon directly, says she, or I'll make it the worse for you. I'll let out your secret. I can ruin you for life if I choose to open my lips. My own words, repeated exactly from what I had said the day before, repeated in his presence, as if they had come from herself. He sat speechless, as white as the paper I am writing on, while I pushed her out of the room. When he recovered himself, no, I am too respectable a woman to mention what he said when he recovered himself. My pen is the pen of a member of the rector's congregation and a subscriber to the Wednesday lectures on justification by faith. How can you expect me to employ it in writing bad language? Suppose, for yourself, the raging, swearing frenzy of the lowest ruffian in England, and let us get on together, as fast as may be, to the way in which it all ended. It ended, as you probably guessed by this time, in his insisting on securing his own safety by shutting her up. I tried to set things right. I told him that she had merely repeated, like a parrot, the words she had heard me say, and that she knew no particulars whatever, because I had mentioned none. I explained that she had affected, out of crazy spite against him, to know what she really did not know, that she only wanted to threaten him and aggravate him for speaking to her, as he had just spoken, and that my unlucky words gave her just the chance of doing mischief of which she was in search. I referred him to other queer ways of hers, and to his own experience of the vagaries of half-witted people. It was all to no purpose. He would not believe me on my oath. He was absolutely certain I had betrayed the whole secret. In short, he would hear of nothing but shutting her up. Under these circumstances, I did my duty as a mother. No pauper asylum, I said. I won't have her put in a pauper asylum. A private establishment, if you please. I have my feelings as a mother, and my character to preserve in the town, and I will submit to nothing but a private establishment, of the sort which my genteel neighbors would choose for afflicted relatives of their own. Those are my words. It is gratifying to me to reflect that I did my duty. Though never overfond of my late daughter, I had a proper pride about her. No pauper stain, thanks to my firmness and resolution, ever rested on my child. Having carried my point, which I did the more easily, in consequence of the facilities offered by private asylums, I could not refuse to admit that there were certain advantages gained by shutting her up. In the first place, she was taken excellent care of, being treated, as I took care to mention in the town, on the footing of a lady. In the second place, she was kept away from Welmingham, where she might have set people suspecting and inquiring by repeating my own incautious words. The only drawback of putting her under restraint was a very slight one. We merely turned her empty boast about knowing the secret into a fixed delusion. Having first spoken in sheer crazy spitefulness against the man who had offended her, she was cunning enough to see that she had seriously frightened him, and sharp enough afterwards to discover that he was concerned in shutting her up. The consequence was she flamed out into a perfect frenzy of passion against him, going to the asylum, and the first words she said to the nurses, after they had quieted her, were that she was put in confinement for knowing his secret, and that she meant to open her lips and ruin him when the right time came. She may have said the same thing to you, when you thoughtlessly assisted her escape. She certainly said it, as I heard last summer, to the unfortunate woman who married our sweet-tempered, nameless gentleman lately deceased. If either you, or that unlucky lady, had questioned my daughter closely and had insisted on her explaining what she really meant, you would have found her lose all her self-importance suddenly, and get vacant, and restless, and confused. You would have discovered that I am writing nothing here but the plain truth. She knew that there was a secret. She knew who was connected with it. She knew who would suffer by its being known. And beyond that, whatever airs of importance she may have given herself, whatever crazy boasting she may have indulged in with strangers, she never to her dying day knew more. Have I satisfied your curiosity? I have taken pains enough to satisfy it, at any rate. There is really nothing else I have to tell you about myself or my daughter. My worst responsibilities, so far as she was concerned, were all over when she was secured in the asylum. I had a form of letter relating to the circumstances under which she was shut up, given me to write, in answer to one Miss Holcomb, who was curious in the matter, and who must have heard plenty of lies about me from a certain tongue well accustomed to the telling of the same. And I did what I could afterwards to trace my runaway daughter, and prevent her from doing mischief by making inquiries myself in the neighborhood where she was falsely reported to have been seen. But these, and other trifles like them, are of little or no interest to you after what you have heard already. So far, I have written in the friendliest possible spirit. But I cannot close this letter without adding a word here of serious remonstrance and reproof addressed to yourself. In the course of your personal interview with me, you audaciously referred to my late daughter's parentage on the father's side, as if that parentage was a matter of doubt. This was highly improper and very ungentlemanlike on your part. If we see each other again, remember, if you please, that I will allow no liberties to be taken with my reputation, and that the moral atmosphere of Welmingham, to use a favorite expression of my friend the rector's, must not be tainted by loose conversation of any kind. If you allow yourself to doubt that my husband was Anne's father, you personally insult me in the grossest manner. If you have felt, and if you still continue to feel, an unhallowed curiosity on this subject, I recommend you, in your own interest, to check it at once and forever. On this side of the grave, Mr. Hartright, whatever may happen on the other, that curiosity will never be gratified. Perhaps, after what I have just said, you will see the necessity of writing me an apology. Do so, and I will willingly receive it. I will, afterwards, if your wishes point to a second interview with me, go a step farther and receive you. My circumstances only enable me to invite you to tea. Not that they are at all altered for the worse by what has happened. I have always lived, as I think I told you, well within my income, and I have saved enough in the last 20 years to make me quite comfortable for the rest of my life. It is not my intention to leave Welmingham. There are one or two little advantages which I have still to gain in the town. The clergyman bows to me, as you saw. He is married, and his wife is not quite so civil. I propose to join the Dorcas Society, and I mean to make the clergyman's wife bow to me next. If you favor me with your company, pray understand that the conversation must be entirely on general subjects. Any attempted reference to this letter will be quite useless. I am determined not to acknowledge having written it. The evidence has been destroyed in the fire, I know, but I think it desirable to err on the side of caution. Nevertheless, on this account no names are mentioned here, nor is any signature attached to these lines. The handwriting is disguised throughout, and I mean to deliver the letter myself, under circumstances which will prevent all fear of its being traced to my house. You can have no possible cause to complain of these precautions, seeing that they do not affect the information I here communicate, in consideration of the special indulgence which you have deserved at my hands. My hour for tea is 5:30, and my buttered toast waits for nobody. The story continued by Walter Hartright. My first impulse, after reading Mrs. Catherick's extraordinary narrative, was to destroy it. The hardened, shameless depravity of the whole composition, from beginning to end, the atrocious perversity of mind which persistently associated me with a calamity for which I was in no sense answerable, and with a death which I had risked my life in trying to avert, so disgusted me that I was on the point of tearing the letter, when a consideration suggested itself which warned me to wait a little before I destroyed it. This consideration was entirely unconnected with Sir Percival. The information communicated to me, so far as it concerned him, did little more than confirm the conclusions at which I had already arrived. He had committed his offense, as I had supposed him to have committed it, and the absence of all reference, on Mrs. Catherick's part, to the duplicate register at Knowlesbury, strengthened my previous conviction that the existence of the book, and the risk of detection which it implied, must have been necessarily unknown to Sir Percival. My interest in the question of the forgery was now at an end, and my only object in keeping the letter was to make it of some future service in clearing up the last mystery that still remained to baffle me, the parentage of Anne Catherick on the father's side. There were one or two sentences dropped in her mother's narrative, which it might be useful to refer to again, when matters of more immediate importance allowed me leisure to search for the missing evidence. I did not despair of still finding that evidence, and I had lost none of my anxiety to discover it, for I had lost none of my interest in tracing the father of the poor creature who now lay at rest in Mrs. Fairley's grave. Accordingly, I sealed up the letter and put it away carefully in my pocketbook to be referred to again when the time came. The next day was my last in Hampshire, when I had appeared again before the magistrate at Knowlesbury, and when I had attended at the adjourned inquest, I should be free to return to London by the afternoon or the evening train. My first errand in the morning was, as usual, to the post office. The letter from Marian was there, but I thought when it was handed to me that it felt unusually light. I anxiously opened the envelope. There was nothing inside but a small strip of paper folded in two. The few blotted, hurriedly written lines which were traced on it contained these words: "Come back as soon as you can. I have been obliged to move. Come to Gower's Walk, Fulham No. 5. I will be on the lookout for you. Don't be alarmed about us. We are both safe and well. But come back to Marian." The news which those lines contained, news which I instantly associated with some attempted treachery on the part of Count Fosco, fairly overwhelmed me. I stood breathless with the paper crumpled up in my hand. What had happened? What subtle wickedness had the Count planned and executed in my absence? A night had passed since Marian's note was written. Hours must elapse still before I could get back to them. Some new disaster might have happened already of which I was ignorant. And here, miles and miles away from them, here I must remain, held, doubly held, at the disposal of the law. I hardly know to what forgetfulness of my obligations anxiety and alarm might not have tempted me, but for the quieting influence of my faith in Marian. My absolute reliance on her was the one earthly consideration which helped me to restrain myself and gave me courage to wait. The inquest was the first of the impediments in the way of my freedom of action. I attended it at the appointed time, the legal formalities requiring my presence in the room, but as it turned out, not calling on me to repeat my evidence. This useless delay was a hard trial, although I did my best to quiet my impatience by following the course of the proceedings as closely as I could. The London solicitor of the deceased, Mr. Merriman, was among the persons present, but he was quite unable to assist the objects of the inquiry. He could only say that he was inexpressibly shocked and astonished, and that he could throw no light whatever on the mysterious circumstances of the case. At intervals during the adjourned investigation, he suggested questions which the coroner put, but which led to no results. After a patient inquiry, which lasted nearly 3 hours, and which exhausted every available source of information, the jury pronounced the customary verdict in cases of sudden death by accident. They added to the formal decision a statement that there had been no evidence to show how the keys had been abstracted, how the fire had been caused, or what the purpose was for which the deceased had entered the vestry. This act closed the proceedings. The legal representative of the dead man was left to provide for the necessities of the interment, and the witnesses were free to retire. Resolved not to lose a minute in getting to Knowlesbury, I paid my bill at the hotel and hired a fly to take me to the town. A gentleman who heard me give the order, and who saw that I was going alone, informed me that he lived in the neighborhood of Knowlesbury, and asked if I would have any objection to his getting home by sharing the fly with me. I accepted his proposal as a matter of course. Our conversation during the drive was naturally occupied by the one absorbing subject of local interest. My new acquaintance had some knowledge of the late Sir Percival's solicitor, and he and Mr. Merriman had been discussing the state of the deceased gentleman's affairs and the succession to the property. Sir Percival's embarrassments were so well known all over the county that his solicitor could only make a virtue of necessity and plainly acknowledge them. He had died without leaving a will, and he had no personal property to bequeath, even if he had made one, the whole fortune which he had derived from his wife having been swallowed up by his creditors. The heir to the estate, Sir Percival having left no issue, was a son of Sir Felix Glyde's first cousin, an officer in command of an East Indiaman. He would find his unexpected inheritance sadly encumbered, but the property would recover with time, and, if the captain was careful, he might be a rich man yet before he died. Absorbed as I was in the one idea of getting to London, this information, which events proved to be perfectly correct, had an interest of its own to attract my attention. I thought it justified me in keeping secret my discovery of Sir Percival's fraud. The heir, whose rights he had usurped, was the heir who would now have the estate. The income from it, for the last 23 years, which should properly have been his, and which the dead man had squandered to the last farthing, was gone beyond recall. If I spoke, my speaking would confer advantage on no one. If I kept the secret, my silence concealed the character of the man who had cheated Laura into marrying him. For her sake, I wish to conceal it. For her sake still, I tell this story under feigned names. I parted with my chance companion at Knowlesbury, and went at once to the town hall. As I had anticipated, no one was present to prosecute the case against me. The necessary formalities were observed, and I was discharged. On leaving the court, a letter from Mr. Dawson was put into my hand. It informed me that he was absent on professional duty, and it reiterated the offer I had already received from him of any assistance which I might require at his hands. I wrote back, warmly acknowledging my obligations to his kindness, and apologizing for not expressing my thanks personally in consequence of my immediate recall on pressing business to town. Half an hour later, I was speeding back to London by the express train. It was between 9 and 10 o'clock before I reached Fulham and found my way to Gower's Walk. Both Laura and Marion came to the door to let me in. I think we had hardly known how close the tie was which bound us three together, until the evening came which united us again. We met as if we had been parted for months instead of for a few days only. Marion's face was sadly worn and anxious. I saw who had known all the danger and borne all the trouble in my absence the moment I looked at her. Laura's brighter looks and better spirits told me how carefully she had been spared all knowledge of the dreadful death at Welmingham, and of the true reason of our change of abode. The stir of the removal seemed to have cheered and interested her. She only spoke of it as a happy thought of Marion's to surprise me on my return with a change from the close, noisy street to the pleasant neighborhood of trees and fields and the river. She was full of projects for the future, of the drawings she was to finish, of the purchasers I had found in the country who were to buy them, of the shillings and sixpences she had saved, till her purse was so heavy that she proudly asked me to weigh it in my own hand. The change for the better which had been wrought in her during the few days of my absence was a surprise to me for which I was quite unprepared, and for all the unspeakable happiness of seeing it, I was indebted to Marion's courage and to Marion's love. When Laura had left us, and when we could speak to one another without restraint, I tried to give some expression to the gratitude and the admiration which filled my heart. But the generous creature would not wait to hear me. That sublime self-forgetfulness of women, which yields so much and asks so little, turned all her thoughts from herself to me. I had only a moment left before post time, she said, or I should have written less abruptly. You look worn and weary, Walter. I am afraid my letter must have seriously alarmed you. Only at first, I replied. My mind was quieted, Marion, by my trust in you. Was I right in attributing this sudden change of place to some threatened annoyance on the part of Count Fosco? Perfectly right, she said. I saw him yesterday, and worse than that, Walter. I spoke to him. Spoke to him? Did he know where we lived? Did he come to the house? He did. To the house, but not upstairs. Laura never saw him. Laura suspects nothing. I will tell you how it happened. The danger, I believe and hope, is over now. Yesterday, I was in the sitting room at our old lodgings. Laura was drawing at the table, and I was walking about and setting things to rights. I passed the window, and as I passed it, looked out into the street. There, on the opposite side of the way, I saw the Count with a man talking to him. Did he notice you at the window? No. At least I thought not. I was too violently startled to be quite sure. Who was the other man? A stranger? Not a stranger, Walter. As soon as I could draw my breath again, I recognized him. He was the owner of the lunatic asylum. Was the Count pointing out the house to him? No. They were talking together as if they had accidentally met in the street. I remained at the window, looking at them from behind the curtain. If I had turned round, and if Laura had seen my face at that moment. Thank God, she was absorbed over her drawing. They soon parted. The man from the asylum went one way, and the Count the other. I began to hope they were in the street by chance, till I saw the Count come back, stop opposite to us again, take out his card case and pencil, write something, and then cross the road to the shop below us. I ran past Laura before she could see me, and said I had forgotten something upstairs. As soon as I was out of the room, I went down to the first landing and waited. I was determined to stop him if he tried to come upstairs. He made no such attempt. The girl from the shop came through the door into the passage, with his card in her hand, a large gilt card with his name, and a coronet above it, and these lines underneath in pencil. Dear lady, yes. The villain could address me in that way still. Dear lady, one word, I implore you on a matter serious to us both. If one can think at all, in serious difficulties, one thinks quick. I felt directly that it might be a fatal mistake to leave myself, and to leave you in the dark, where such a man as the Count was concerned. I felt that the doubt of what he might do, in your absence, would be 10 times more trying to me if I declined to see him than if I consented. Ask the gentleman to wait in the shop, I said. I will be with him in a moment. I ran upstairs for my bonnet, being determined not to let him speak to me indoors. I knew his deep, ringing voice, and I was afraid Laura might hear it, even in the shop. In less than a minute I was down again in the passage, and had opened the door into the street. He came round to meet me from the shop. There he was in deep mourning, with his smooth bow and his deadly smile, and some idle boys and women near him, staring at his great size, his fine black clothes, and his large cane with the gold knob to it. All the horrible time at Blackwater came back to me the moment I set eyes on him. All the old loathing crept and crawled through me, when he took off his hat with a flourish and spoke to me, as if we had parted on the friendliest terms hardly a day since. You remember what he said? I can't repeat it, Walter. You shall know directly what he said about you, but I can't repeat what he said to me. It was worse than the polite insolence of his letter. My hands tingled to strike him, as if I had been a man. I only kept them quiet by tearing his card to pieces under my shawl. Without saying a word on my side, I walked away from the house for fear of Laura seeing us, and he followed, protesting softly all the way. In the first by-street I turned, and asked him what he wanted with me. He wanted 2 things. First, if I had no objection to express his sentiments. I declined to hear them. Secondly, to repeat the warning in his letter. I asked what occasion there was for repeating it. He bowed and smiled, and said he would explain. The explanation exactly confirmed the fears I expressed before you left us. I told you, if you remember, that Sir Percival would be too headstrong to take his friend's advice where you were concerned, and that there was no danger to be dreaded from the Count till his own interests were threatened, and he was roused into acting for himself. I recollect, Marian. Well, so it has really turned out. The Count offered his advice, but it was refused. Sir Percival would only take counsel of his own violence, his own obstinacy, and his own hatred of you. The Count let him have his way, first privately ascertaining, in case of his own interests being threatened next, where we lived. You were followed, Walter, on returning here, after your first journey to Hampshire, by the lawyer's men for some distance from the railway, and by the Count himself to the door of the house. How he contrived to escape being seen by you he did not tell me, but he found us out on that occasion, and in that way. Having made the discovery, he took no advantage of it till the news reached him of Sir Percival's death, and then, as I told you, he acted for himself, because he believed you would next proceed against the dead man's partner in the conspiracy. He at once made his arrangements to meet the owner of the asylum in London, and to take him to the place where his runaway patient was hidden, believing that the results, whichever way they ended, would be to involve you in interminable legal disputes and difficulties, and to tie your hands for all purposes of offense, so far as he was concerned. That was his purpose, on his own confession to me. The only consideration which made him hesitate at the last moment. Yes, it is hard to acknowledge it, Walter, and yet I must. I was the only consideration. No words can say how degraded I feel in my own estimation when I think of it, but the one weak point in that man's iron character is the horrible admiration he feels for me. I have tried, for the sake of my own self-respect, to disbelieve it as long as I could, but his looks, his actions, force on me the shameful conviction of the truth. The eyes of that monster of wickedness moistened while he was speaking to me. They did, Walter. He declared that at the moment of pointing out the house to the doctor, he thought of my misery if I was separated from Laura, of my responsibility if I was called on to answer for effecting her escape, and he risked the worst that you could do to him, the second time, for my sake. All he asked was that I would remember the sacrifice and restrain your rashness in my own interests, interests which he might never be able to consult again. I made no such bargain with him. I would have died first. But believe him or not, whether it is true or false that he sent the doctor away with an excuse, one thing is certain. I saw the man leave him without so much as a glance at our window, or even at our side of the way. I believe it, Marion. The best men are not consistent in good. Why should the worst men be consistent in evil? At the same time, I suspect him of merely attempting to frighten you, by threatening what he cannot really do. I doubt his power of annoying us, by means of the owner of the asylum, now that Sir Percival is dead, and Mrs. Catherick is free from all control. But let me hear more. What did the Count say of me? He spoke last of you. His eyes brightened and hardened, and his manner changed to what I remember it in past times, to that mixture of pitiless resolution and mountebank mockery which makes it so impossible to fathom him. Warn Mr. Hartright, he said in his loftiest manner. He has a man of brains to deal with, a man who snaps his big fingers at the laws and conventions of society when he measures himself with me. If my lamented friend had taken my advice, the business of the inquest would have been with the body of Mr. Hartright. But my lamented friend was obstinate. See, I mourn his loss, inwardly in my soul, outwardly on my hat. This trivial crepe expresses sensibilities which I summon Mr. Hartright to respect. They may be transformed to immeasurable enmities if he ventures to disturb them. Let him be content with what he has got, with what I leave unmolested for your sake, to him and to you. Say to him with my compliments, if he stirs me, he is Fosco to deal with. In the English of the popular tongue, I inform him, Fosco sticks at nothing. Dear lady, good morning. His cold gray eyes settled on my face. He took off his hat solemnly, bowed bareheaded, and left me, without returning, without saying more last words. He turned at the corner of the street and waved his hand, and then struck it theatrically on his breast. I lost sight of him after that. He disappeared in the opposite direction to our house, and I ran back to Laura. Before I was indoors again, I had made up my mind that we must go. The house, especially in your absence, was a place of danger instead of a place of safety, now that the Count had discovered it. If I could have felt certain of your return, I should have risked waiting till you came back. But I was certain of nothing, and I acted at once on my own impulse. You had spoken, before leaving us, of moving into a quieter neighborhood and purer air, for the sake of Laura's health. I had only to remind her of that, and to suggest surprising you and saving you trouble by managing the move in your absence, to make her quite as anxious for the change as I was. She helped me to pack up your things, and she has arranged them all for you in your new working room here. What made you think of coming to this place? My ignorance of other localities in the neighborhood of London. I felt the necessity of getting as far away as possible from our old lodgings, and I knew something of Fulham because I had once been at school there. I dispatched a messenger with a note on the chance that the school might still be in existence. It was in existence. The daughters of my old mistress were carrying it on for her, and they engaged this place from the instructions I had sent. It was just post time when the messenger returned to me with the address of the house. We moved after dark. We came here quite unobserved. Have I done right, Walter? Have I justified your trust in me? I answered her warmly and gratefully, as I really felt. But the anxious look still remained on her face while I was speaking, and the first question she asked, when I had done, related to Count Fosco. I saw that she was thinking of him now, with a changed mind. No fresh outbreak of anger against him, no new appeal to me to hasten the day of reckoning escaped her. Her conviction that the man's hateful admiration of herself was really sincere seemed to have increased 100-fold her distrust of his unfathomable cunning, her inborn dread of the wicked energy and vigilance of all his faculties. Her voice fell low, her manner was hesitating, her eyes searched into mine with an eager fear when she asked me what I thought of his message, and what I meant to do next after hearing it. Not many weeks have passed, Marion, I answered, since my interview with Mr. Curl. When he and I parted, the last words I said to him about Laura were these: her uncle's house shall open to receive her, in the presence of every soul who followed the false funeral to the grave. The lie that records her death shall be publicly erased from the tombstone by the authority of the head of the family, and the 2 men who have wronged her shall answer for their crime to me, though the justice that sits in tribunals is powerless to pursue them. One of those men is beyond mortal reach. The other remains, and my resolution remains." Her eyes lit up. Her color rose. She said nothing, but I saw all her sympathies gathering to mine in her face. "I don't disguise from myself, or from you," I went on, "that the prospect before us is more than doubtful. The risks we have run already are, it may be, trifles compared with the risks that threaten us in the future, but the venture shall be tried, Marian, for all that. I am not rash enough to measure myself against such a man as the Count before I am well prepared for him. I have learnt patience. I can wait my time. Let him believe that his message has produced its effect. Let him know nothing of us, and hear nothing of us. Let us give him full time to feel secure. His own boastful nature, unless I seriously mistake him, will hasten that result. This is one reason for waiting, but there is another more important still. My position, Marian, towards you and towards Laura ought to be a stronger one than it is now before I try our last chance." She leaned near to me with a look of surprise. "How can it be stronger?" she asked. "I will tell you," I replied, "when the time comes. It has not come yet. It may never come at all. I may be silent about it to Laura forever. I must be silent now, even to you, till I see for myself that I can harmlessly and honorably speak. Let us leave that subject. There is another which has more pressing claims on our attention. You have kept Laura, mercifully kept her, in ignorance of her husband's death. Oh, Walter, surely it must be long yet before we tell her of it? No, Marian. Better that you should reveal it to her now, than that accident, which no one can guard against, should reveal it to her at some future time. Spare her all the details. Break it to her very tenderly, but tell her that he is dead. You have a reason, Walter, for wishing her to know of her husband's death besides the reason you have just mentioned? I have a reason connected with that subject which must not be mentioned between us yet, which may never be mentioned to Laura at all." She dwelt on the last words meaningly. When I answered her in the affirmative, I dwelled on them too. Her face grew pale. For a while she looked at me with a sad, hesitating interest. An unaccustomed tenderness trembled in her dark eyes and softened her firm lips, as she glanced aside at the empty chair in which the dear companion of all our joys and sorrows had been sitting. "I think I understand," she said. "I think I owe it to her and to you, Walter, to tell her of her husband's death." She sighed and held my hand fast for a moment, then dropped it abruptly and left the room. On the next day, Laura knew that his death had released her, and that the error and the calamity of her life lay buried in his tomb. His name was mentioned among us no more. Thenceforward, we shrank from the slightest approach to the subject of his death, and in the same scrupulous manner, Marian and I avoided all further reference to that other subject, which, by her consent and mine, was not to be mentioned between us yet. It was not the less present in our minds. It was rather kept alive in them by the restraint which we had imposed on ourselves. We both watched Laura more anxiously than ever, sometimes waiting and hoping, sometimes waiting and fearing, till the time came. By degrees we returned to our accustomed way of life. I resumed the daily work which had been suspended during my absence in Hampshire. Our new lodgings cost us more than the smaller and less convenient rooms which we had left, and the claim thus implied on my increased exertions was strengthened by the doubtfulness of our future prospects. Emergencies might yet happen which would exhaust our little fund at the banker's, and the work of my hands might be, ultimately, all we had to look to for support. More permanent and more lucrative employment than had yet been offered to me was a necessity of our position, a necessity for which I now diligently set myself to provide. It must not be supposed that the interval of rest and seclusion of which I am now writing entirely suspended, on my part, all pursuit of the one absorbing purpose with which my thoughts and actions are associated in these pages. That purpose was, for months and months yet, never to relax its claims on me. The slow ripening of it still left me a measure of precaution to take, an obligation of gratitude to perform, and a doubtful question to solve. The measure of precaution related, necessarily, to the Count, It was of the last importance to ascertain, if possible, whether his plans committed him to remaining in England, or, in other words, to remaining within my reach. I contrived to set this doubt at rest by very simple means. His address in Street Johnswood being known to me, I inquired in the neighborhood, and having found out the agent who had the disposal of the furnished house in which he lived, I asked if number 5, Forest Road, was likely to be let within a reasonable time. The reply was in the negative. I was informed that the foreign gentleman then residing in the house had renewed his term of occupation for another 6 months, and would remain in possession until the end of June in the following year. We were then at the beginning of December only. I left the agent with my mind relieved from all present fear of the Count's escaping me. The obligation I had to perform took me once more into the presence of Mrs. Clements. I had promised to return, and to confide to her those particulars relating to the death and burial of Catherick which I had been obliged to withhold at our first interview. Changed as circumstances now were, there was no hindrance to my trusting the good woman with as much of the story of the conspiracy as it was necessary to tell. I had every reason that sympathy and friendly feeling could suggest to urge on me the speedy performance of my promise, and I did conscientiously and carefully perform it. There is no need to burden these pages with any statement of what passed at the interview. It will be more to the purpose to say that the interview itself necessarily brought to my mind the one doubtful question still remaining to be solved, the question of Catherick's parentage on the father's side. A multitude of small considerations in connection with this subject, trifling enough in themselves, but strikingly important when massed together, had latterly led my mind to a conclusion which I resolved to verify. I obtained Marian's permission to write to Major Donthorne of Varneck Hall, where Mrs. Catherick had lived in service for some years previous to her marriage, to ask him certain questions. I made the inquiries in Marian's name, and described them as relating to matters of personal history in her family, which might explain and excuse my application. When I wrote the letter, I had no certain knowledge that Major Donthorne was still alive. I dispatched it on the chance that he might be living and able and willing to reply. After a lapse of 2 days, proof came, in the shape of a letter, that the Major was living, and that he was ready to help us. The idea in my mind when I wrote to him, and the nature of my inquiries will be easily inferred from his reply. His letter answered my questions by communicating these important facts. In the first place, the late Sir Percival Glyde of Blackwater Park had never set foot in Varneck Hall. The deceased gentleman was a total stranger to Major Donthorne and to all his family. In the second place, the late Mr. Philip Fairley of Limmeridge House had been, in his younger days, the intimate friend and constant guest of Major Donthorne. Having refreshed his memory by looking back to old letters and other papers, the Major was in a position to say positively that Mr. Philip Fairley was staying at Varneck Hall in the month of August, 1826, and that he remained there for the shooting during the month of September and part of October following. He then left, to the best of the Major's belief, for Scotland, and did not return to Varneck Hall till after a lapse of time, when he reappeared in the character of a newly married man. Taken by itself, this statement was, perhaps, of little positive value, but taken in connection with certain facts, every one of which either Marian or I knew to be true, it suggested one plain conclusion that was, to our minds, irresistible. Knowing, now, that Mr. Philip Fairley had been at Varneck Hall in the autumn of 1826, and that Mrs. Catherick had been living there in service at the same time, we knew also, first, that it had been born in June 1827, secondly, that she had always presented an extraordinary personal resemblance to Laura, and thirdly, that Laura herself was strikingly like her father. Mr. Philip Fairley had been one of the notoriously handsome men of his time. In disposition entirely unlike his brother Frederick, he was the spoilt darling of society, especially of the women, an easy, light-hearted, impulsive, affectionate man, generous to a fault, constitutionally lax in his principles, and notoriously thoughtless of moral obligations where women were concerned. Such were the facts we knew, such was the character of the man. Surely the plain inference that follows needs no pointing out? Read by the new light which had now broken upon me. Even Mrs. Catherick's letter, in despite of herself, rendered its mite of assistance towards strengthening the conclusion at which I had arrived. She had described Mrs. Fairley, in writing to me, as plain-looking and as having entrapped the handsomest man in England into marrying her. Both assertions were gratuitously made, and both were false. Jealous dislike, which in such a woman as Mrs. Catherick would express itself in petty malice rather than not express itself at all, appeared to me to be the only assignable cause for the peculiar insolence of her reference to Mrs. Fairlie, under circumstances which did not necessitate any reference at all. The mention here of Mrs. Fairlie's name naturally suggests one other question. Did she ever suspect whose child the little girl brought to her at Limmeridge might be? Marian's testimony was positive on this point. Mrs. Fairlie's letter to her husband, which had been read to me in former days, the letter describing Anne's resemblance to Laura and acknowledging her affectionate interest in the little stranger, had been written, beyond all question, in perfect innocence of heart. It even seemed doubtful, on consideration, whether Mr. Philip Fairlie himself had been nearer than his wife to any suspicion of the truth. The disgracefully deceitful circumstances under which Mrs. Catherick had married, the purpose of concealment which the marriage was intended to answer, might well keep her silent for caution's sake, perhaps for her own pride's sake also, even assuming that she had the means, in his absence, of communicating with the father of her unborn child. As this surmise floated through my mind, there rose on my memory the remembrance of the Scripture denunciation, which we have all thought of in our time with wonder and with awe. The sins of the father shall be visited on the children. But for the fatal resemblance between the two daughters of one father, the conspiracy of which and had been the innocent instrument, and Laura, the innocent victim, could never have been planned. With what unerring and terrible directness the long chain of circumstances led down from the thoughtless wrong committed by the father to the heartless injury inflicted on the child. These thoughts came to me, and others with them, which drew my mind away to the little Cumberland churchyard where Anne Catherick now lay buried. I thought of the bygone days when I had met her by Mrs. Fairlie's grave, and met her for the last time. I thought of her poor helpless hands beating on the tombstone, and her weary, yearning words murmured to the dead remains of her protectress and her friend. "Oh, if I could die, and be hidden and at rest with you." Little more than a year had passed since she breathed that wish, and how inscrutably, how awfully, it had been fulfilled. The words she had spoken to Laura by the shores of the lake, the very words had now come true. "Oh, if I could only be buried with your mother! If I could only wake at her side when the angels' trumpet sounds and the graves give up their dead at the resurrection! Through what mortal crime and horror, through what darkest windings of the way down to death, the lost creature had wandered in God's leading to the last home that, living, she never hoped to reach. In that sacred rest I leave her. In that dread companionship let her remain undisturbed." So the ghostly figure which has haunted these pages, as it haunted my life, goes down into the impenetrable gloom. Like a shadow, she first came to me in the loneliness of the night. Like a shadow, she passes away in the loneliness of the dead. For months elapsed. April came, the month of spring, the month of change. The course of time had flowed through the interval since the winter peacefully and happily in our new home. I had turned my long leisure to good account, had largely increased my sources of employment, and had placed our means of subsistence on surer grounds. Freed from the suspense and the anxiety which had tried her so sorely and hung over her so long, Marian's spirits rallied, and her natural energy of character began to assert itself again, with something, if not all, of the freedom and the vigor of former times. More pliable under change than her sister, Laura showed more plainly the progress made by the healing influences of her new life. The worn and wasted look which had prematurely aged her face was fast leaving it, and the expression which had been the first of its charms in past days was the first of its beauties that now returned. My closest observations of her detected but one serious result of the conspiracy which had once threatened her reason and her life. Her memory of events, from the period of her leaving Blackwater Park to the period of our meeting in the burial ground of Limmeridge Church, was lost beyond all hope of recovery. At the slightest reference to that time, she changed and trembled still. Her words became confused. Her memory wandered and lost itself as helplessly as ever. Here, and here only, the traces of the past lay deep, too deep to be effaced. In all else, she was now so far on the way to recovery that, on her best and brightest days, she sometimes looked and spoke like the Laura of old times. The happy change wrought its natural result in us both. From their long slumber, on her side and on mine, those imperishable memories of our past life in Cumberland now awoke, which were one and all alike, the memories of our love. Gradually and insensibly our daily relations towards each other became constrained. The fond words which I had spoken to her so naturally in the days of her sorrow and her suffering faltered strangely on my lips. In the time when my dread of losing her was most present to my mind, I had always kissed her when she left me at night and when she met me in the morning. The kiss seemed now to have dropped between us, to be lost out of our lives. Our hands began to tremble again when they met. We hardly ever looked long at one another out of Marian's presence. The talk often flagged between us when we were alone. When I touched her by accident, I felt my heart beating fast, as it used to beat at Limmeridge House. I saw the lovely answering flush glowing again in her cheeks, as if we were back among the Cumberland Hills in our past characters of master and pupil once more. She had long intervals of silence and thoughtfulness, and denied she had been thinking when Marian asked her the question. I surprised myself one day, neglecting my work to dream over the little watercolor portrait of her which I had taken in the summer house where we first met, just as I used to neglect Mr. Fairley's drawings to dream over the same likeness when it was newly finished in the bygone time. Changed as all the circumstances now were, our position towards each other in the golden days of our first companionship seemed to be revived with the revival of our love. It was as if time had drifted us back on the wreck of our early hopes to the old familiar shore. To any other woman, I could have spoken the decisive words which I still hesitated to speak to her. The utter helplessness of her position, her friendless dependence on all the forbearing gentleness that I could show her, my fear of touching too soon some secret sensitiveness in her which my instinct as a man might not have been fine enough to discover. These considerations and others like them kept me self-distrustfully silent. And yet I knew that the restraint on both sides must be ended, that the relations in which we stood towards one another must be altered in some settled manner for the future, and that it rested with me, in the first instance, to recognize the necessity for a change. The more I thought of our position, the harder the attempt to alter it appeared, while the domestic conditions on which we three had been living together since the winter remained undisturbed. I cannot account for the capricious state of mind in which this feeling originated, but the idea nevertheless possessed me that some previous change of place and circumstances, some sudden break in the quiet monotony of our lives, so managed as to vary the home aspect under which we had been accustomed to see each other, might prepare the way for me to speak, and might make it easier and less embarrassing for Laura and Marian to hear. With this purpose in view, I said one morning that I thought we had all earned a little holiday and a change of scene. After some consideration, it was decided that we should go for a fortnight to the seaside. On the next day, we left Fulham for a quiet town on the south coast. At that early season of the year, we were the only visitors in the place. The cliffs, the beach, and the walks inland were all in the solitary condition which was most welcome to us. The air was mild. The prospects over hill and wood and down were beautifully varied by the shifting April light and shade, and the restless sea leapt under our windows, as if it felt, like the land, the glow and freshness of spring. I owed it to Marian to consult her before I spoke to Laura, and to be guided afterwards by her advice. On the third day from our arrival, I found a fit opportunity of speaking to her alone. The moment we looked at one another, her quick instinct detected the thought in my mind before I could give it expression. With her customary energy and directness, she spoke at once and spoke first. "You are thinking of that subject which was mentioned between us on the evening of your return from Hampshire," she said. "I have been expecting you to allude to it for some time past. There must be a change in our little household, Walter. We cannot go on much longer as we are now. I see it as plainly as you do, as plainly as Laura sees it, though she says nothing. How strangely the old times in Cumberland seem to have come back. You and I are together again, and the one subject of interest between us is Laura once more. I could almost fancy that this room is the summer house at Limmeridge, and that those waves beyond us are beating on our seashore. I was guided by your advice in those past days, I said, and now, Marian, with reliance tenfold greater, I will be guided by it again. She answered by pressing my hand. I saw that she was deeply touched by my reference to the past. We sat together near the window, and while I spoke and she listened, we looked at the glory of the sunlight shining on the majesty of the sea. Whatever comes of this confidence between us, I said, whether it ends happily or sorrowfully for me, Laura's interests will still be the interests of my life. When we leave this place, on whatever terms we leave it, my determination to wrest from Count Fosco the confession, which I failed to obtain from his accomplice, goes back with me to London, as certainly as I go back myself. Neither you nor I can tell how that man may turn on me. If I bring him to bay, we only know, by his own words and actions, that he is capable of striking at me through Laura without a moment's hesitation or a moment's remorse. In our present position, I have no claim on her which society sanctions, which the law allows to strengthen me in resisting him and in protecting her. This places me at a serious disadvantage. If I am to fight our cause with the Count, strong in the consciousness of Laura's safety, I must fight it for my wife. Do you agree to that, Marian, so far? To every word of it, she answered. I will not plead out of my own heart, I went on. I will not appeal to the love which has survived all changes and all shocks. I will rest my only vindication of myself for thinking of her, and speaking of her as my wife, on what I have just said. If the chance of forcing a confession from the Count is, as I believe it to be, the last chance left of publicly establishing the fact of Laura's existence, the least selfish reason that I can advance for our marriage is recognized by us both. But I may be wrong in my conviction. Other means of achieving our purpose may be in our power, which are less uncertain and less dangerous. I have searched anxiously, in my own mind, for those means, and I have not found them. Have you? No. I have thought about it too, and thought in vain. In all likelihood, I continued, the same questions have occurred to you, in considering this difficult subject which have occurred to me. Ought we to return with her to Limmeridge, now that she is like herself again, and trust to the recognition of her by the people of the village, or by the children at the school? Ought we to appeal to the practical test of her handwriting? Suppose we did so. Suppose the recognition of her obtained, and the identity of the handwriting established. Would success in both those cases do more than supply an excellent foundation for a trial in a court of law? Would the recognition and the handwriting prove her identity to Mr. Fairley and take her back to Limmeridge House, against the evidence of her aunt, against the evidence of the medical certificate, against the fact of the funeral and the fact of the inscription on the tomb? No. We could only hope to succeed in throwing a serious doubt on the assertion of her death, a doubt which nothing short of a legal inquiry can settle. I will assume that we possess, what we have certainly not got, money enough to carry this inquiry on through all its stages. I will assume that Mr. Fairley's prejudices might be reasoned away, that the false testimony of the Count and his wife, and all the rest of the false testimony, might be confuted, that the recognition could not possibly be ascribed to a mistake between Laura and Catherick, or the handwriting be declared by our enemies to be a clever fraud. All these are assumptions which, more or less, set plain probabilities at defiance. But let them pass, and let us ask ourselves what would be the first consequence, or the first questions put to Laura herself on the subject of the conspiracy. We know only too well what the consequence would be, for we know that she has never recovered her memory of what happened to her in London. Examine her privately, or examine her publicly, she is utterly incapable of assisting the assertion of her own case. If you don't see this, Marian, as plainly as I see it, we will go to Limmeridge and try the experiment tomorrow. I do see it, Walter. Even if we had the means of paying all the law expenses, even if we succeeded in the end, the delays would be unendurable. The perpetual suspense, after what we have suffered already, would be heartbreaking. You are right about the hopelessness of going to Limmeridge. I wish I could feel sure that you are right also in determining to try that last chance with the Count. Is it a chance at all? Beyond a doubt, yes. It is the chance of recovering the lost date of Laura's journey to London. Without returning to the reasons I gave you some time since, I am still as firmly persuaded as ever that there is a discrepancy between the date of that journey and the date on the certificate of death. There lies the weak point of the whole conspiracy. It crumbles to pieces if we attack it in that way, and the means of attacking it are in possession of the Count. If I succeed in wresting them from him, the object of your life and mine is fulfilled. If I fail, the wrong that Laura has suffered will, in this world, never be redressed. Do you fear failure yourself, Walter? I dare not anticipate success, and for that very reason, Marian, I speak openly and plainly as I have spoken now. In my heart and my conscience I can say it. Laura's hopes for the future are at their lowest ebb. I know that her fortune is gone. I know that the last chance of restoring her to her place in the world lies at the mercy of her worst enemy, of a man who is now absolutely unassailable, and who may remain unassailable to the end. With every worldly advantage gone from her, with all prospect of recovering her rank and station more than doubtful, with no clearer future before her than the future which her husband can provide, the poor drawing master may harmlessly open his heart at last. In the days of her prosperity, Marian, I was only the teacher who guided her hand. I asked for it. In her adversity, as the hand of my wife, Marian's eyes met mine affectionately. I could say no more. My heart was full. My lips were trembling. In spite of myself, I was in danger of appealing to her pity. I got up to leave the room. She rose at the same moment, laid her hand gently on my shoulder, and stopped me. "Walter," she said, "I once parted you both, for your good and for hers. Wait here, my brother. Wait, my dearest best friend, till Laura comes and tells you what I have done now." For the first time since the farewell morning at Limmeridge, she touched my forehead with her lips. A tear dropped on my face as she kissed me. She turned quickly, pointed to the chair from which I had risen, and left the room. I sat down alone at the window to wait through the crisis of my life. My mind in that breathless interval felt like a total blank. I was conscious of nothing but a painful intensity of all familiar perceptions. The sun grew blinding bright. The white sea birds chasing each other far beyond me seemed to be flitting before my face. The mellow murmur of the waves on the beach was like thunder in my ears. The door opened, and Laura came in alone. So she had entered the breakfast room at Limmeridge House on the morning when we parted. Slowly and falteringly, in sorrow and in hesitation, she had once approached me. Now she came with the haste of happiness in her feet, with the light of happiness radiant in her face. Of their own accord those dear arms clasped themselves round me. Of their own accord the sweet lips came to meet mine. "My darling," she whispered, "we may own we love each other now?" Her head nestled with a tender contentedness on my bosom. "Oh," she said innocently, "I am so happy at last." 10 days later, we were happier still. We were married. The course of this narrative, steadily flowing on, bears me away from the morning time of our married life, and carries me forward to the end. In a fortnight more we three were back in London, and the shadow was stealing over us of the struggle to come. Marian and I were careful to keep Laura in ignorance of the cause that had hurried us back, the necessity of making sure of the Count. It was now the beginning of May, and his term of occupation at the house in Forest Road expired in June. If he renewed it, and I had reasons, shortly to be mentioned, for anticipating that he would, I might be certain of his not escaping me. But if by any chance he disappointed my expectations and left the country, then I had no time to lose in arming myself to meet him as I best might. In the first fullness of my new happiness, there had been moments when my resolution faltered, moments when I was tempted to be safely content, now that the dearest aspiration of my life was fulfilled in the possession of Laura's love. For the first time I thought faint-heartedly of the greatness of the risk, of the adverse chances arrayed against me, of the fair promise of our new life, and of the peril in which I might place the happiness which we had so hardly earned. Yes, let me own it honestly. For a brief time I wandered, in the sweet guiding of love, far from the purpose to which I had been true under sterner discipline and in darker days. Innocently Laura had tempted me aside from the hard path. Innocently she was destined to lead me back again. At times, dreams of the terrible past still disconnectedly recalled to her, in the mystery of sleep, the events of which her waking memory had lost all trace. One night, barely 2 weeks after our marriage, When I was watching her at rest, I saw the tears come slowly through her closed eyelids. I heard the faint murmuring words escape her which told me that her spirit was back again on the fatal journey from Blackwater Park. That unconscious appeal, so touching and so awful in the sacredness of her sleep, ran through me like fire. The next day was the day we came back to London, the day when my resolution returned to me with tenfold strength. The first necessity was to know something of the man. Thus far, the true story of his life was an impenetrable mystery to me. I began with such scanty sources of information as were at my own disposal. The important narrative written by Mr. Frederick Fairley, which Marian had obtained by following the directions I had given to her in the winter, proved to be of no service to the special object with which I now looked at it. While reading it, I reconsidered the disclosure revealed to me by Mrs. Clements of the series of deceptions which had brought Catherick to London, and which had there devoted her to the interests of the conspiracy. Here again, the Count had not openly committed himself. Here again, he was to all practical purpose out of my reach. I next returned to Marian's journal at Blackwater Park. At my request, she read to me again a passage which referred to her past curiosity about the Count, and to the few particulars which she had discovered relating to him. The passage to which I allude occurs in that part of her journal which delineates his character and his personal appearance. She describes him as not having crossed the frontiers of his native country for years past, as anxious to know if any Italian gentlemen were settled in the nearest town to Blackwater Park, as receiving letters with all sorts of odd stamps on them, and one with a large official-looking seal on it. She is inclined to consider that his long absence from his native country may be accounted for by assuming that he is a political exile. But she is, on the other hand, unable to reconcile this idea with the reception of the letter from abroad bearing the large official-looking seal, letters from the continent addressed to political exiles being usually the last to court attention from foreign post offices in that way. The considerations thus presented to me in the diary, joined to certain surmises of my own that grew out of them, suggested a conclusion which I wondered I had not arrived at before. I now said to myself, what Laura had once said to Marian at Blackwater Park, what Madame Fosco had overheard by listening at the door. The Count is a spy. Laura had applied the word to him at hazard, in natural anger at his proceedings towards herself. I applied it to him with the deliberate conviction that his vocation in life was the vocation of a spy. On this assumption, the reason for his extraordinary stay in England so long after the objects of the conspiracy had been gained became, to my mind, quite intelligible. The year of which I am now writing was the year of the famous Crystal Palace exhibition in Hyde Park. Foreigners in unusually large numbers had arrived already, and were still arriving in England. Men were among us, by hundreds, whom the ceaseless distrustfulness of their governments had followed privately, by means of appointed agents, to our shores. My surmises did not for a moment class a man of the Count's abilities and social position with the ordinary rank and file of foreign spies. I suspected him of holding a position of authority, of being entrusted by the government which he secretly served with the organization and management of agents specially employed in this country, both men and women, and I believe Mrs. Rubbell, who had been so opportunely found to act as nurse at Blackwater Park, to be, in all probability, one of the number. Assuming that this idea of mine had a foundation in truth, the position of the Count might prove to be more assailable than I had hitherto ventured to hope. To whom could I apply to know something more of the man's history and of the man himself than I knew now? In this emergency, it naturally occurred to my mind that a countryman of his own, on whom I could rely, might be the fittest person to help me. The first man whom I thought of under these circumstances was also the only Italian with whom I was intimately acquainted, my quaint little friend, Professor Pesca. The professor has been so long absent from these pages that he has run some risk of being forgotten altogether. It is the necessary law of such a story as mine that the persons concerned in it only appear when the course of events takes them up. They come and go, not by favor of my personal partiality, but by right of their direct connection with the circumstances to be detailed. For this reason, not Pesco alone, but my mother and sister as well, have been left far in the background of the narrative. My visits to the Hampstead cottage, my mother's belief in the denial of Laura's identity, which the conspiracy had accomplished, my vain efforts to overcome the prejudice on her part and on my sister's to which, in their jealous affection for me. They both continued to adhere, the painful necessity which that prejudice imposed on me of concealing my marriage from them till they had learned to do justice to my wife. All these little domestic occurrences have been left unrecorded because they were not essential to the main interest of the story. It is nothing that they added to my anxieties and embittered my disappointments. The steady march of events has inexorably passed them by. For the same reason, I have said nothing here of the consolation that I found in Pesca's brotherly affection for me when I saw him again after the sudden cessation of my residence at Limmeridge House. I have not recorded the fidelity with which my warm-hearted little friend followed me to the place of embarkation when I sailed for Central America, or the noisy transport of joy with which he received me when we next met in London. If I had felt justified in accepting the offers of service which he made to me on my return, he would have appeared again long ere this. But, though I knew that his honor and his courage were to be implicitly relied on, I was not so sure that his discretion was to be trusted, and, for that reason only, I followed the course of all my inquiries alone. It will now be sufficiently understood that Pesca was not separated from all connection with me and my interests, although he has hitherto been separated from all connection with the progress of this narrative. He was as true and as ready a friend of mine still as ever he had been in his life. Before I summoned Pesca to my assistance, it was necessary to see for myself what sort of man I had to deal with. Up to this time, I had never once set eyes on Count Fosco. 3 days after my return with Laura and Marian to London, I set forth alone for Forest Road, St. John's Wood, between 10 and 11 o'clock in the morning. It was a fine day. I had some hours to spare, and I thought it likely, if I waited a little for him, that the Count might be tempted out. I had no great reason to fear the chance of his recognizing me in the daytime, for the only occasion when I had been seen by him was the occasion on which he had followed me home at night. No one appeared at the windows in the front of the house. I walked down a turning which ran past the side of it and looked over the low garden wall. One of the back windows on the lower floor was thrown up, and a net was stretched across the opening. I saw nobody, but I heard, in the room, first a shrill whistling and singing of birds, then the deep, ringing voice which Marian's description had made familiar to me. "Come out on my little finger, my pretties," cried the voice. "Come out and hop upstairs. 1, 2, 3, and up. 3, 2, 1, and down. 1, 2, 3, twit, 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 tweet." The Count was exercising his canaries as he used to exercise them in Marian's time at Blackwater Park. I waited a little while, and the singing and the whistling ceased. "Come, kiss me, my pretties," said the deep voice. There was a responsive twittering and chirping, a low, oily laugh, a silence of a minute or so, and then I heard the opening of the house door. I turned and retraced my steps. The magnificent melody of the prayer in Rossini's Moses, sung in a sonorous bass voice, rose grandly through the suburban silence of the place. The front garden gate opened and closed. The Count had come out. He crossed the road and walked towards the western boundary of the Regent's Park. I kept on my own side of the way, a little behind him, and walked in that direction also. Marian had prepared me for his high stature, his monstrous corpulence, and his ostentatious mourning garments, but not for the horrible freshness and cheerfulness and vitality of the man. He carried his 60 years as if they had been fewer than 40. He sauntered along, wearing his hat a little on one side, with a light, jaunty step, swinging his big stick, humming to himself, looking up from time to time at the houses and gardens on either side of him with superb, smiling patronage. If a stranger had been told that the whole neighborhood belonged to him, that stranger would not have been surprised to hear it. He never looked back. He paid no apparent attention to me, no apparent attention to anyone who passed him on his own side of the road, except now and then, when he smiled and smirked with an easy paternal good humor at the nursery maids and the children whom he met. In this way he led me on, till we reached a colony of shops outside the western terraces of the park. Here he stopped at a pastry cook's, went in, probably to give an order, and came out again immediately with a tart in his hand. An Italian was grinding an organ before the shop, and a miserable little shriveled monkey was sitting on the instrument. The Count stopped, bit a piece for himself out of the tart, and gravely handed the rest to the monkey. "My poor little man," he said, with grotesque tenderness, "you look hungry." In the sacred name of humanity, I offer you some lunch." The organ grinder piteously put in his claim to a penny from the benevolent stranger. The Count shrugged his shoulders contemptuously and passed on. We reached the streets and the better class of shops between the New Road and Oxford Street. The Count stopped again and entered a small optician's shop, with an inscription in the window announcing that repairs were neatly executed inside. He came out again with an opera glass in his hand, walked a few paces on, and stopped to look at a bill of the opera placed outside a music seller's shop. He read the bill attentively, considered a moment, and then hailed an empty cab as it passed him. "Opera box office," he said to the man, and was driven away. I crossed the road and looked at the bill in my turn. The performance announced was Lucrezia Borgia, and it was to take place that evening. The opera glass in the Count's hand, his careful reading of the bill, and his direction to the cabman all suggested that he proposed making one of the audience. I had the means of getting an admission for myself and a friend to the pit by applying to one of the scene painters attached to the theater, with whom I had been well acquainted in past times. There was a chance at least that the Count might be easily visible among the audience to me and to anyone with me, and in this case I had the means of ascertaining whether Pesca knew his countryman or not that very night. This consideration at once decided the disposal of my evening. I procured the tickets, leaving a note at the professor's lodgings on the way. At 7:45, I called to take him with me to the theater. My little friend was in a state of the highest excitement, with a festive flower in his buttonhole and the largest opera glass I ever saw hugged up under his arm. "Are you ready?" I asked. "Right, all right," said Pesca. We started for the theater. The last notes of the introduction to the opera were being played, and the seats in the pit were all filled when Pesca and I reached the theater. There was plenty of room, however, in the passage that ran round the pit, precisely the position best calculated to answer the purpose for which I was attending the performance. I went first to the barriers separating us from the stalls and looked for the Count in that part of the theater. He was not there. Returning along the passage, on the left-hand side from the stage, and looking about me attentively, I discovered him in the pit. He occupied an excellent place, some 12 or 14 seats from the end of a bench, within 3 rows of the stalls. I placed myself exactly on a line with him, Pesca standing by my side. The professor was not yet aware of the purpose for which I had brought him to the theater, and he was rather surprised that we did not move nearer to the stage. The curtain rose, and the opera began. Throughout the whole of the first act we remained in our position, the Count, absorbed by the orchestra and the stage, never casting so much as a chance glance at us. Not a note of Donizetti's delicious music was lost on him. There he sat, high above his neighbors, smiling, and nodding his great head enjoyingly from time to time. When the people near him applauded the close of an air, as an English audience in such circumstances always will applaud, without the least consideration for the orchestral movement which immediately followed it, he looked round at them with an expression of compassionate remonstrance, and held up one hand with a gesture of polite entreaty. At the more refined passages of the singing, at the more delicate phases of the music, which passed unapplauded by others, his fat hands, adorned with perfectly fitting black kid gloves, softly patted each other, in token of the cultivated appreciation of a musical man. At such times, his oily murmur of approval, "Bravo! Bra-eh!" hummed through the silence, like the purring of a great cat. His immediate neighbors on either side, hearty, ruddy-faced people from the country, basking amazedly in the sunshine of fashionable London, seeing and hearing him, began to follow his lead. Many a burst of applause from the pit that night started from the soft, comfortable patting of the black-gloved hands. The man's voracious vanity devoured this implied tribute to his local and critical supremacy with an appearance of the highest relish. Smiles rippled continuously over his fat face. He looked about him, at the pauses in the music, serenely satisfied with himself and his fellow creatures. Yes, yes, these barbarous English people are learning something from me. Here, there, and everywhere, I, Fosco, am an influence that is felt, a man who sits supreme. If ever face spoke, his face spoke then, and that was its language. The curtain fell on the first act, and the audience rose to look about them. This was the time I had waited for, the time to try if Pesca knew him. He rose with the rest and surveyed the occupants of the boxes grandly with his opera glass. At first his back was towards us, but he turned round in time to our side of the theater and looked at the boxes above us, using his glass for a few minutes, then removing it, but still continuing to look up. This was the moment I chose, when his full face was in view, for directing Pesca's attention to him. "Do you know that man?" I asked. "Which man, my friend?" "The tall, fat man, standing there, with his face towards us." Pesca raised himself on tiptoe and looked at the Count. "No," said the professor. "The big fat man is a stranger to me." "Is he famous?" "Why do you point him out?" "Because I have particular reasons for wishing to know something of him. He is a countryman of yours. His name is Count Fosco." "Do you know that name?" "Not I, Walter. Neither the name nor the man is known to me." "Are you quite sure you don't recognize him?" "Look again. Look carefully. I will tell you why I am so anxious about it when we leave the theater." "Stop. Let me help you up here, where you can see him better." I helped the little man to perch himself on the edge of the raised dais upon which the pit seats were all placed. His small stature was no hindrance to him. Here he could see over the heads of the ladies who were seated near the outermost part of the bench. A slim, light-haired man standing by us, whom I had not noticed before, a man with a scar on his left cheek, looked attentively at Pesca as I helped him up, and then looked still more attentively, following the direction of Pesca's eyes, at the Count. Our conversation might have reached his ears, and might, as it struck me, have roused his curiosity. Meanwhile, Pesca fixed his eyes earnestly on the broad, full, smiling face turned a little upward, exactly opposite to him. "No," he said, "I have never set my two eyes on that big fat man before in all my life." As he spoke, the Count looked downwards towards the boxes behind us on the pit tier. The eyes of the two Italians met. The instant before I had been perfectly satisfied, from his own reiterated assertion, that Pesca did not know the Count. The instant afterwards, I was equally certain that the Count knew Pesca, knew him, and more surprising still, feared him as well. There was no mistaking the change that passed over the villain's face. The leaden hue that altered his yellow complexion in a moment, the sudden rigidity of all his features, the furtive scrutiny of his cold gray eyes, the motionless stillness of him from head to foot told their own tale. A mortal dread had mastered him body and soul, and his own recognition of Pesca was the cause of it. The slim man with the scar on his cheek was still close by us. He had apparently drawn his inference from the effect produced on the Count by the sight of Pesca as I had drawn mine. He was a mild, gentlemanlike man, looking like a foreigner, and his interest in our proceedings was not expressed in anything approaching to an offensive manner. For my own part, one was so startled by the change in the Count's face, so astounded at the entirely unexpected turn which events had taken, that I knew neither what to say or do next. Pesca roused me by stepping back to his former place at my side and speaking first. "How the fat man stares!" he exclaimed. "Is it at me? Am I famous? How can he know me when I don't know him?" I kept my eyes still on the Count. I saw him move for the first time when Pesca moved, so as not to lose sight of the little man in the lower position in which he now stood. I was curious to see what would happen if Pesca's attention under these circumstances was withdrawn from him, and I accordingly asked the professor if he recognized any of his pupils that evening among the ladies in the boxes. Pesca immediately raised the large opera glass to his eyes and moved it slowly all round the upper part of the theater, searching for his pupils with the most conscientious scrutiny. The moment he showed himself to be thus engaged, the Count turned round, slipped past the persons who occupied seats on the farther side of him from where we stood, and disappeared in the middle passage down the center of the pit. I caught Pesca by the arm, and to his inexpressible astonishment, hurried him round with me to the back of the pit to intercept the Count before he could get to the door. Somewhat to my surprise, the slim man hastened out before us, avoiding a stoppage caused by some people on our side of the pit leaving their places, by which Pesca and myself were delayed. When we reached the lobby, the Count had disappeared, and the foreigner with the scar was gone too. "Come home," I said. "Come home, Pesca, to your lodgings. I must speak to you in private. I must speak directly." "My soul, bless my soul," cried the professor, in a state of the extremest bewilderment. "What on earth is the matter?" I walked on rapidly without answering. The circumstances under which the Count had left the theater suggested to me that his extraordinary anxiety to escape Pesca might carry him to further extremities still. He might escape me, too, by leaving London. I doubted the future if I allowed him so much as a day's freedom to act as he pleased. And I doubted that foreign stranger who had got the start of us, and whom I suspected of intentionally following him out. With this double distrust in my mind, I was not long in making Pesca understand what I wanted. As soon as we two were alone in his room, I increased his confusion and amazement 100-fold by telling him what my purpose was as plainly and unreservedly as I have acknowledged it here. "My friend, what can I do?" cried the professor, piteously appealing to me with both hands. "Deuce, what the deuce? How can I help you, Walter, when I don't know the man? He knows you. He is afraid of you. He has left the theater to escape you. Pesca, there must be a reason for this. Look back into your own life before you came to England. You left Italy, as you have told me yourself, for political reasons. You have never mentioned those reasons to me, and I don't inquire into them now. I only ask you to consult your own recollections, and to say if they suggest no past cause for the terror which the first sight of you produced in that man." To my unutterable surprise, these words, harmless as they appeared to me, produced the same astounding effect on Pesca which the sight of Pesca had produced on the Count. The rosy face of my little friend whitened in an instant, and he drew back from me slowly, trembling from head to foot. "Walter," he said, "you don't know what you ask." He spoke in a whisper. He looked at me as if I had suddenly revealed to him some hidden danger to both of us. In less than 1 minute of time, he was so altered from the easy, lively, quaint little man of all my past experience that if I had met him in the street, changed as I saw him now, I should most certainly not have known him again. "Forgive me if I have unintentionally pained and shocked you," I replied. "Remember the cruel wrong my wife has suffered at Count Fosco's hands. Remember that the wrong can never be redressed, unless the means are in my power of forcing him to do her justice. I spoke in her interests. Pesca, I ask you again to forgive me. I can say no more." I rose to go. He stopped me before I reached the door. "Wait," he said. "You have shaken me from head to foot. You don't know how I left my country and why I left my country. Let me compose myself. Let me think if I can." I returned to my chair. He walked up and down the room, talking to himself incoherently in his own language. After several turns backwards and forwards, he suddenly came up to me and laid his little hands with a strange tenderness and solemnity on my breast. "On your heart and soul, Walter," he said, "is there no other way to get to that man but the chance way, through me?" "There is no other way," I answered. He left me again, opened the door of the room, and looked out cautiously into the passage, closed it once more, and came back. "You won your right over me, Walter," he said, "on the day when you saved my life. It was yours from that moment, when you pleased to take it. Take it now. Yes, I mean what I say. My next words, as true as the good God is above us, will put my life into your hands." The trembling earnestness with which he uttered this extraordinary warning carried with it, to my mind, the conviction that he spoke the truth. "Mind this," he went on, shaking his hands at me in the vehemence of his agitation. "I hold no thread in my own mind between that man Fosco and the pastime which I call back to me for your sake. If you find the thread, keep it to yourself. Tell me nothing. On my knees I beg and pray. Let me be ignorant. Let me be innocent. Let me be blind to all the future as I am now." He said a few words more, hesitatingly and disconnectedly, then stopped again. I saw that the effort of expressing himself in English, on an occasion too serious to permit him the use of the quaint turns and phrases of his ordinary vocabulary, was painfully increasing the difficulty he had felt from the first in speaking to me at all. Having learnt to read and understand his native language, though not to speak it, in the earlier days of our intimate companionship, I now suggested to him that he should express himself in Italian, while I used English in putting any questions which might be necessary to my enlightenment. He accepted the proposal. In his smooth-flowing language, spoken with a vehement agitation which betrayed itself in the perpetual working of his features, in the wildness and the suddenness of his foreign gesticulations, but never in the raising of his voice. I now heard the words which armed me to meet the last struggle that is left for this story to record. 3. It is only right to mention here that I repeat Pesco's statement to me with the careful suppressions and alterations which the serious nature of the subject and my own sense of duty to my friend demand. My first and last concealments from the reader are those which caution renders absolutely necessary in this portion of the narrative. You know nothing of my motive for leaving Italy, he began, except that it was for political reasons. If I had been driven to this country by the persecution of my government, I should not have kept those reasons a secret from you or from anyone. I have concealed them because no government authority has pronounced the sentence of my exile. You have heard, Walter, of the political societies that are hidden in every great city on the continent of Europe. To one of those societies I belonged in Italy and belong still in England. When I came to this country, I came by the direction of my chief. I was overzealous in my younger time. I ran the risk of compromising myself and others. For those reasons, I was ordered to emigrate to England and to wait. I emigrated. I have waited. I wait still. Tomorrow I may be called away. 10 years hence, I may be called away. It is all one to me. I am here, I support myself by teaching, and I wait. I violate no oath. You shall hear why presently, in making my confidence complete by telling you the name of the society to which I belong. All I do is to put my life in your hands. If what I say to you now is ever known by others to have passed my lips, as certainly as we two sit here, I am a dead man. He whispered the next words in my ear. I keep the secret which he thus communicated. The society to which he belonged will be sufficiently individualized for the purpose of these pages, if I call it the Brotherhood, on the few occasions when any reference to the subject will be needed in this place. The object of the Brotherhood, Pesco went on, is briefly the object of other political societies of the same sort, the destruction of tyranny and the assertion of the rights of the people. The principles of the Brotherhood are two. So long as a man's life is useful, or even harmless only, he has the right to enjoy it. But if his life inflicts injury on the well-being of his fellow men, from that moment he forfeits the right, and it is not only no crime, but a positive merit to deprive him of it. It is not for me to say in what frightful circumstances of oppression and suffering this society took its rise. It is not for you to say, you Englishmen, who have conquered your freedom so long ago, that you have conveniently forgotten what blood you shed and what extremities you proceeded to in the conquering. It is not for you to say how far the worst of all exasperations may, or may not, carry the maddened men of an enslaved nation. The iron that has entered into our souls has gone too deep for you to find it. Leave the refugee alone. Laugh at him. Distrust him. Open your eyes and wonder at that secret self which smolders in him, sometimes under the everyday respectability and tranquility of a man like me, sometimes under the grinding poverty, the fierce squalor of men less lucky, less pliable, less patient than I am. But judge us not. In the time of your first Charles, you might have done us justice. The long luxury of your own freedom has made you incapable of doing us justice now. All the deepest feelings of his nature seemed to force themselves to the surface in those words. All his heart was poured out to me for the first time in our lives, but still his voice never rose, still his dread of the terrible revelation he was making to me never left him. So far, he resumed, you think the society like other societies. Its object, in your English opinion, is anarchy and revolution. It takes the life of a bad king or a bad minister, as if the one and the other were dangerous wild beasts to be shot at the first opportunity. I grant you this. But the laws of the Brotherhood are the laws of no other political society on the face of the earth. The members are not known to one another. There is a president in Italy. There are presidents abroad. Each of these has a secretary. The presidents and the secretaries know the members, but the members, among themselves, are all strangers until their chiefs see fit, in the political necessity of the time, or in the private necessity of the society, to make them known to each other. With such a safeguard as this, there is no oath among us on admittance. We are identified with the Brotherhood by a secret mark, which we all bear, which lasts while our lives last. We are told to go about our ordinary business, and to report ourselves to the president or the secretary 4 times a year in the event of our services being required. We are warned, if we betray the brotherhood, or if we injure it by serving other interests, that we die by the principles of the brotherhood, die by the hand of a stranger who may be sent from the other end of the world to strike the blow, or by the hand of our own bosom friend, who may have been a member unknown to us through all the years of our intimacy. Sometimes the death is delayed, sometimes it follows close on the treachery. It is our first business to know how to wait, our second business to know how to obey when the word is spoken. Some of us may wait our lives through and may not be wanted. Some of us may be called to the work or to the preparation for the work the very day of our admission. I myself, the little, easy, cheerful man you know, who of his own accord would hardly lift up his handkerchief to strike down the fly that buzzes about his face. I, in my younger time, under provocation so dreadful that I will not tell you of it, entered the brotherhood by an impulse, as I might have killed myself by an impulse. I must remain in it now. It has got me, whatever I may think of it in my better circumstances and my cooler manhood, to my dying day. While I was still in Italy, I was chosen secretary, and all the members of that time who were brought face to face with my president were brought face to face also with me. I began to understand him. I saw the end towards which his extraordinary disclosure was now tending. He waited a moment, watching me earnestly, watching till he had evidently guessed what was passing in my mind before he resumed. "You have drawn your own conclusion already," he said. "I see it in your face. Tell me nothing. Keep me out of the secret of your thoughts. Let me make my one last sacrifice of myself for your sake, and then have done with this subject, never to return to it again." He signed to me not to answer him, rose, removed his coat, and rolled up the shirt sleeve on his left arm. "I promised you that this confidence should be complete," he whispered, speaking close at my ear, with his eyes looking watchfully at the door. "Whatever comes of it, you shall not reproach me with having hidden anything from you which it was necessary to your interests to know. I have said that the brotherhood identifies its members by a mark that lasts for life. See the place, and the mark on it for yourself." He raised his bare arm, and showed me, high on the upper part of it, and in the inner side, a brand deeply burned in the flesh and stained of a bright blood-red color. I abstain from describing the device which the brand represented. It will be sufficient to say that it was circular in form, and so small that it would have been completely covered by a shilling coin. "A man who has this mark branded in this place," he said, covering his arm again, "is a member of the brotherhood. A man who has been false to the brotherhood is discovered sooner or later by the chiefs who know him, presidents or secretaries, as the case may be. And a man discovered by the chiefs is dead. No human laws can protect him. Remember what you have seen and heard. Draw what conclusions you like. Act as you please. But, in the name of God, whatever you discover, whatever you do, tell me nothing. Let me remain free from a responsibility which it horrifies me to think of, which I know in my conscience is not my responsibility now. For the last time I say it, on my honor as a gentleman, on my oath as a Christian, if the man you pointed out at the opera knows me, he is so altered or so disguised that I do not know him. I am ignorant of his proceedings or his purposes in England. I never saw him, I never heard the name he goes by, to my knowledge, before tonight. I say no more. Leave me a little, Walter. I am overpowered by what has happened. I am shaken by what I have said. Let me try to be like myself again when we meet next." He dropped into a chair, and turning away from me, hid his face in his hands. I gently opened the door so as not to disturb him, and spoke my few parting words in low tones, which he might hear or not, as he pleased. "I will keep the memory of tonight in my heart of hearts," I said. "You shall never repent the trust you have reposed in me. May I come to you tomorrow? May I come as early as 9 o'clock?" "Yes, Walter," he replied, looking up at me kindly, and speaking in English once more, as if his one anxiety now was to get back to our former relations towards each other. "Come to my little bit of breakfast before I go my ways among the pupils that I teach. Good night, Pesca. Good night, my friend." My first conviction as soon as I found myself outside the house was that no alternative was left me but to act at once on the information I had received, to make sure of the count that night, or to risk the loss, if I only delayed till the morning, of Laura's last chance. I looked at my watch. It was 10 o'clock. Not the shadow of a doubt crossed my mind of the purpose for which the Count had left the theater. His escape from us, that evening, was beyond all question the preliminary only to his escape from London. The mark of the Brotherhood was on his arm. I felt as certain of it as if he had shown me the brand, and the betrayal of the Brotherhood was on his conscience. I had seen it in his recognition of Pesca. It was easy to understand why that recognition had not been mutual. A man of the Count's character would never risk the terrible consequences of turning spy without looking to his personal security quite as carefully as he looked to his golden reward. The shaven face, which I had pointed out at the opera, might have been covered by a beard in Pesca's time. His dark brown hair might be a wig. His name was evidently a false one. The accident of time might have helped him as well. His immense corpulence might have come with his later years. There was every reason why Pesca should not have known him again. Every reason also why he should have known Pesca, whose singular personal appearance made a marked man of him, go where he might. I have said that I felt certain of the purpose in the Count's mind when he escaped us at the theater. How could I doubt it when I saw, with my own eyes, that he believed himself, in spite of the change in his appearance, to have been recognized by Pesca, and to be therefore in danger of his life? If I could get speech of him that night, if I could show him that I, too, knew of the mortal peril in which he stood, what result would follow? Plainly this: one of us must be master of the situation. One of us must inevitably be at the mercy of the other. I owed it to myself to consider the chances against me before I confronted them. I owed it to my wife to do all that lay in my power to lessen the risk. The chances against me wanted no reckoning up. They were all merged in one. If the Count discovered by my own avowal that the direct way to his safety lay through my life, he was probably the last man in existence who would shrink from throwing me off my guard and taking that way, when he had me alone within his reach. The only means of defense against him on which I could at all rely to lessen the risk presented themselves, after a little careful thinking, clearly enough. Before I made any personal acknowledgment of my discovery in his presence, I must place the discovery itself where it would be ready for instant use against him, and safe from any attempt at suppression on his part. If I laid the mine under his feet before I approached him, and if I left instructions with a third person to fire it on the expiration of a certain time, unless directions to the contrary were previously received under my own hand, or from my own lips, in that event the Count's security was absolutely dependent upon mine, and I might hold the vantage ground over him securely, even in his own house. This idea occurred to me when I was close to the new lodgings which we had taken on returning from the seaside. I went in without disturbing anyone, by the help of my key. A light was in the hall, and I stole up with it to my workroom to make my preparations, and absolutely to commit myself to an interview with the Count, before either Laura or Marian could have the slightest suspicion of what I intended to do. A letter addressed to Pesca represented the surest measure of precaution which it was now possible for me to take. I wrote as follows: "The man whom I pointed out to you at the opera is a member of the Brotherhood, and has been false to his trust. Put both these assertions to the test instantly. You know the name he goes by in England. His address is number 5 Forest Road, Street Johnswood. On the love you once bore me, use the power entrusted to you without mercy and without delay against that man. I have risked all and lost all, and the forfeit of my failure has been paid with my life." I signed and dated these lines, enclosed them in an envelope, and sealed it up. On the outside I wrote this direction: "Keep the enclosure unopened until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. If you do not hear from me, or see me, before that time, break the seal when the clock strikes, and read the contents." I added my initials, and protected the whole by enclosing it in a second sealed envelope, addressed to Pesca at his lodgings. Nothing remained to be done after this, but to find the means of sending my letter to its destination immediately. I should then have accomplished all that lay in my power. If anything happened to me in the Count's house, I had now provided for his answering it with his life. That the means of preventing his escape, under any circumstances whatever, were at Pesca's disposal, if he chose to exert them, I did not for an instant doubt. The extraordinary anxiety which he had expressed to remain unenlightened as to the Count's identity, or, in other words, to be left uncertain enough about facts to justify him to his own conscience in remaining passive, betrayed plainly that the means of exercising the terrible justice of the Brotherhood were ready to his hand, although, as a naturally humane man, he had shrunk from plainly saying as much in my presence. The deadly certainty with which the vengeance of foreign political societies can hunt down a traitor to the cause, hide himself where he may, had been too often exemplified, even in my superficial experience, to allow of any doubt. Considering the subject only as a reader of newspapers, cases recurred to my memory, both in London and in Paris, of foreigners found stabbed in the streets, whose assassins could never be traced, of bodies and parts of bodies thrown into the Thames and the Seine, by hands that could never be discovered, of deaths by secret violence which could only be accounted for in one way. I have disguised nothing relating to myself in these pages, and I do not disguise here that I believed I had written Count Fosco's death warrant, if the fatal emergency happened which authorized Pesca to open my enclosure. I left my room to go down to the ground floor of the house and speak to the landlord about finding me a messenger. He happened to be ascending the stairs at the time, and we met on the landing. His son, a quick lad, was the messenger he proposed to me on hearing what I wanted. We had the boy upstairs, and I gave him his directions. He was to take the letter in a cab, to put it into Professor Pesca's own hands, and to bring me back a line of acknowledgment from that gentleman, returning in the cab and keeping it at the door for my use. It was then nearly 10:30. I calculated that the boy might be back in 20 minutes, and that I might drive to St. John's Wood, on his return, in 20 minutes more. When the lad had departed on his errand, I returned to my own room for a little while, to put certain papers in order, so that they might be easily found in case of the worst. The key of the old-fashioned bureau in which the papers were kept I sealed up, and left it on my table, with Marian's name written on the outside of the little packet. This done, I went downstairs to the sitting room, in which I expected to find Laura and Marian awaiting my return from the opera. I felt my hand trembling for the first time when I laid it on the lock of the door. No one was in the room but Marian. She was reading, and she looked at her watch in surprise when I came in. "How early you are back," she said. "You must have come away before the opera was over." "Yes," I replied. Neither Pesca nor I waited for the end. "Where is Laura?" She had one of her bad headaches this evening, and I advised her to go to bed when we had done tea. I left the room again on the pretext of wishing to see whether Laura was asleep. Marian's quick eyes were beginning to look inquiringly at my face. Marian's quick instinct was beginning to discover that I had something weighing on my mind. When I entered the bedchamber and softly approached the bedside by the dim flicker of the night lamp, my wife was asleep. We had not been married quite a month yet. If my heart was heavy, if my resolution for a moment faltered again, when I looked at her face turned faithfully to my pillow in her sleep, when I saw her hand resting open on the coverlet, as if it was waiting unconsciously for mine, surely there was some excuse for me? I only allowed myself a few minutes to kneel down at the bedside and to look close at her, so close that her breath, as it came and went, fluttered on my face. I only touched her hand and her cheek with my lips at parting. She stirred in her sleep and murmured my name, but without waking. I lingered for an instant at the door to look at her again. "God bless and keep you, my darling," I whispered, and left her. Marian was at the stairhead waiting for me. She had a folded slip of paper in her hand. "The landlord's son has brought this for you," she said. "He has got a cab at the door. He says you ordered him to keep it at your disposal." "Quite right, Marian. I want the cab. I'm going out again." I descended the stairs as I spoke and looked into the sitting room to read the slip of paper by the light on the table. It contained these two sentences in Pesca's handwriting. "Your letter is received. If I don't see you before the time you mention, I will break the seal when the clock strikes." I placed the paper in my pocketbook and made for the door. Marian met me on the threshold and pushed me back into the room, where the candlelight fell full on my face. She held me by both hands, and her eyes fastened searchingly on mine. "I see," she said in a low, eager whisper. "You're trying the last chance tonight." "Yes, the last chance and the best," I whispered back. "Not alone." "Oh, Walter, for God's sake, not alone. Let me go with you. Don't refuse me, because I'm only a woman. I must go. I will go. I'll wait outside in the cab." It was my turn now to hold her. She tried to break away from me and get down first to the door. "If you want to help me, I said. Stop here and sleep in my wife's room tonight. Only let me go away with my mind easy about Laura, and I answer for everything else. Come, Marion, give me a kiss, and show that you have the courage to wait till I come back. I dared not allow her time to say a word more. She tried to hold me again. I unclasped her hands and was out of the room in a moment. The boy below heard me on the stairs and opened the hall door. I jumped into the cab before the driver could get off the box. Forest Road, St. John's Wood, I called to him through the front window. Double fare if you get there in a quarter of an hour. I'll do it, sir. I looked at my watch. 11 o'clock. Not a minute to lose. The rapid motion of the cab, the sense that every instant now was bringing me nearer to the Count, the conviction that I was embarked at last, without let or hindrance, on my hazardous enterprise, heated me into such a fever of excitement that I shouted to the man to go faster and faster. As we left the streets and crossed St. John's Wood Road, my impatience so completely overpowered me that I stood up in the cab and stretched my head out of the window to see the end of the journey before we reached it. Just as a church clock in the distance struck the quarter past, we turned into the Forest Road. I stopped the driver a little away from the Count's house, paid and dismissed him, and walked onto the door. As I approached the garden gate, I saw another person advancing towards it also from the direction opposite to mine. We met under the gas lamp in the road and looked at each other. I instantly recognized the light-haired foreigner with the scar on his cheek, and I thought he recognized me. He said nothing, and instead of stopping at the house, as I did, he slowly walked on. Was he in the Forest Road by accident? Or had he followed the Count home from the opera? I did not pursue those questions. After waiting a little till the foreigner had slowly passed out of sight, I rang the gate bell. It was then 20 minutes past 11, late enough to make it quite easy for the Count to get rid of me by the excuse that he was in bed. The only way of providing against this contingency was to send him my name without asking any preliminary questions, and to let him know, at the same time, that I had a serious motive for wishing to see him at that late hour. Accordingly, while I was waiting, I took out my card and wrote under my name on important business. The maidservant answered the door while I was writing the last word in pencil, and asked me distrustfully what I pleased to want. "Be so good as to take that to your master," I replied, giving her the card. I saw, by the girl's hesitation of manner, that if I had asked for the Count in the first instance, she would only have followed her instructions by telling me he was not at home. She was staggered by the confidence with which I gave her the card. After staring at me, in great perturbation, she went back into the house with my message, closing the door, and leaving me to wait in the garden. In a minute or so she reappeared, her master's compliments. And would I be so obliging as to say what my business was? "Take my compliments back," I replied, "and say that the business cannot be mentioned to anyone but your master." She left me again returned, and this time asked me to walk in. I followed her at once. In another moment, I was inside the Count's house. There was no lamp in the hall, but by the dim light of the kitchen candle, which the girl had brought upstairs with her, I saw an elderly lady steal noiselessly out of a back room on the ground floor. She cast one viperish look at me as I entered the hall, but said nothing, and went slowly upstairs without returning my bow. My familiarity with Marion's journal sufficiently assured me that the elderly lady was Madame Fosco. The servant led me to the room which the Countess had just left. I entered it, and found myself face to face with the Count. He was still in his evening dress, except his coat, which he had thrown across a chair. His shirt sleeves were turned up at the wrists, but no higher. A carpet bag was on one side of him, and a box on the other. Books, papers, and articles of wearing apparel were scattered about the room. On a table, at one side of the door, stood the cage, so well known to me by description, which contained his white mice. The canaries and the cockatoo were probably in some other room. He was seated before the box, packing it, when I went in, and rose with some papers in his hand to receive me. His face still betrayed plain traces of the shock that had overwhelmed him at the opera. His fat cheeks hung loose, his cold gray eyes were furtively vigilant, his voice, look, and manner were all sharply suspicious alike, as he advanced a step to meet me, and requested, with distant civility, that I would take a chair. "You come here on business, sir," he said. "I am at a loss to know what that business can possibly be." The unconcealed curiosity with which he looked hard in my face while he spoke, convinced me that I had passed unnoticed by him at the opera. He had seen Pesca first, and from that moment till he left the theater, he had evidently seen nothing else. My name would necessarily suggest to him that I had not come into his house with other than a hostile purpose towards himself, but he appeared to be utterly ignorant thus far of the real nature of my errand. "I am fortunate in finding you here tonight," I said. "You seem to be on the point of taking a journey? Is your business connected with my journey?" "In some degree." "In what degree? Do you know where I am going to?" "No. I only know why you are leaving London." He slipped by me with the quickness of thought, locked the door, and put the key in his pocket. "You and I, Mr. Hartright, are excellently well acquainted with one another by reputation," he said. "Did it, by any chance, occur to you when you came to this house that I was not the sort of man you could trifle with?" "It did occur to me," I replied, "and I have not come to trifle with you. I am here on a matter of life and death, and if that door which you have locked was open at this moment, nothing you could say or do would induce me to pass through it." I walked farther into the room and stood opposite to him on the rug before the fireplace. He drew a chair in front of the door and sat down on it, with his left arm resting on the table. The cage with the white mice was close to him, and the little creatures scampered out of their sleeping place as his heavy arm shook the table and peered at him through the gaps in the smartly painted wires. "On a matter of life and death," he repeated to himself. "Those words are more serious, perhaps, than you think." "What do you mean?" "What I say." The perspiration broke out thickly on his broad forehead. His left hand stole over the edge of the table. There was a drawer in it with a lock, and the key was in the lock. His finger and thumb closed over the key, but did not turn it. "So you know why I'm leaving London?" he went on. "Tell me the reason, if you please." He turned the key and unlocked the drawer as he spoke. "I can do better than that," I replied. "I can show you the reason if you like." "How can you show it?" "You have got your coat off," I said. "Roll up the shirt sleeve on your left arm, and you will see it there." The same livid leaden change passed over his face which I had seen pass over it at the theater. The deadly glitter in his eyes shone steady and straight into mine. He said nothing, but his left hand slowly opened the table drawer and softly slipped into it. The harsh, grating noise of something heavy that he was moving unseen to me sounded for a moment, then ceased. The silence that followed was so intense that the faint ticking nibble of the white mice at their wires was distinctly audible where I stood. My life hung by a thread, and I knew it. At that final moment, I thought with his mind, I felt with his fingers. I was as certain as if I had seen it of what he kept hidden from me in the drawer. "Wait a little," I said. "You have got the door locked. You see I don't move. You see my hands are empty. Wait a little. I have something more to say." "You have said enough," he replied, with a sudden composure so unnatural and so ghastly that it tried my nerves as no outbreak of violence could have tried them. "I want one moment for my own thoughts, if you please. Do you guess what I am thinking about?" "Perhaps I do." "I am thinking," he remarked quietly, "whether I shall add to the disorder in this room by scattering your brains about the fireplace." If I had moved at that moment, I saw in his face that he would have done it. "I advise you to read 2 lines of writing which I have about me," I rejoined, "before you finally decide that question." The proposal appeared to excite his curiosity. He nodded his head. I took Pesca's acknowledgment of the receipt of my letter out of my pocketbook, handed it to him at arm's length, and returned to my former position in front of the fireplace. He read the lines aloud. "Your letter is received. If I don't hear from you before the time you mention, I will break the seal when the clock strikes." Another man in his position would have needed some explanation of those words. The Count felt no such necessity. One reading of the note showed him the precaution that I had taken as plainly as if he had been present at the time when I adopted it. The expression of his face changed on the instant, and his hand came out of the drawer empty. "I don't lock up my drawer, Mr. Hartright," he said, "and I don't say that I may not scatter your brains about the fireplace yet. But I am a just man even to my enemy, and I will acknowledge beforehand that they are cleverer brains than I thought them. Come to the point, sir. You want something of me?" "I do, and I mean to have it." "On conditions?" "On no conditions." His hand dropped into the drawer again. "Bah! We are traveling in a circle," he said, "and those clever brains of yours are in danger again. Your tone is deplorably imprudent, sir. Moderated on the spot. The risk of shooting you on the place where you stand is less to me than the risk of letting you out of this house, except on conditions that I dictate and approve. You have not got my lamented friend to deal with now. You are face to face with Fosco. If the lives of 20 Mr. Hartrights were the stepping stones to my safety, over all those stones I would go, sustained by my sublime indifference, self-balanced by my impenetrable calm. Respect me. If you love your own life, I summon you to answer 3 questions before you open your lips again. Hear them. They are necessary to this interview. Answer them. They are necessary to me. He held up one finger of his right hand. First question, he said. You come here possessed of information which may be true or may be false. Where did you get it? I decline to tell you. No matter. I shall find out. If that information is true, mind I say, with the whole force of my resolution, if you are making your market of it here by treachery of your own or by treachery of some other man. I note that circumstance for future use in my memory, which forgets nothing, and proceed. He held up another finger. Second question. Those lines you invited me to read are without signature. Who wrote them? A man whom I have every reason to depend on, and whom you have every reason to fear. My answer reached him to some purpose. His left hand trembled audibly in the drawer. How long do you give me, he asked, putting his third question in a quieter tone, before the clock strikes and the seal is broken? Time enough for you to come to my terms, I replied. Give me a plainer answer, Mr. Hartright. What hour is the clock to strike? 9 tomorrow morning. 9 tomorrow morning? Yes, yes. Your trap is laid for me before I can get my passport regulated and leave London. It is not earlier, I suppose? We will see about that presently. I can keep you hostage here and bargain with you to send for your letter before I let you go. In the meantime, be so good next as to mention your terms. You shall hear them. They are simple and soon stated. You know whose interests I represent in coming here. He smiled with the most supreme composure and carelessly waved his right hand. I consent to hazard a guess, he said jeeringly. A lady's interests, of course. My wife's interests. He looked at me with the first honest expression that had crossed his face in my presence, an expression of blank amazement. I could see that I sank in his estimation as a dangerous man from that moment. He shut up the drawer at once, folded his arms over his breast, and listened to me with a smile of satirical attention. You are well enough aware, I went on, of the course which my inquiries have taken for many months past, to know that any attempted denial of plain facts will be quite useless in my presence. You are guilty of an infamous conspiracy, and the gain of a fortune of £10,000 was your motive for it. He said nothing, but his face became overclouded suddenly by a lowering anxiety. Keep your gain, I said. His face lightened again immediately, and his eyes opened on me in wider and wider astonishment. I am not here to disgrace myself by bargaining for money which has passed through your hands, and which has been the price of a vile crime. Gently, Mr. Hartright. Your moral claptraps have an excellent effect in England. Keep them for yourself and your own countrymen, if you please. The £10,000 was a legacy left to my excellent wife by the late Mr. Fairley. Place the affair on those grounds, and I will discuss it if you like. To a man of my sentiments, however, the subject is deplorably sordid. I prefer to pass it over. I invite you to resume the discussion of your terms. What do you demand? In the first place, I demand a full confession of the conspiracy, written and signed in my presence by yourself. He raised his finger again. 1, he said, checking me off with the steady attention of a practical man. In the second place, I demand a plain proof, which does not depend on your personal asseveration, of the date at which my wife left Blackwater Park and traveled to London. So, you can lay your finger, I see, on the weak place, he remarked composedly. Any more? At present, no more. Good. You have mentioned your terms, now listen to mine. The responsibility to myself of admitting what you are pleased to call the conspiracy is less, perhaps, upon the whole, than the responsibility of laying you dead on that hearthrug. Let us say that I meet your proposal, on my own conditions. The statement you demand of me shall be written, and the plain proof shall be produced. You call a letter from my late lamented friend, informing me of the day and hour of his wife's arrival in London, written, signed, and dated by himself, a proof, I suppose? I can give you this. I can also send you to the man of whom I hired the carriage to fetch my visitor from the railway, on the day when she arrived. His order book may help you to your date, even if his coachman who drove me proves to be of no use. These things I can do, and will do on conditions. I recite them. First condition, Madame Fosco and I leave this house when and how we please, without interference of any kind on your part. Second condition, you wait here, in company with me, to see my agent, who is coming at 7 o'clock in the morning to regulate my affairs. You give my agent a written order to the man who has got your sealed letter to resign his possession of it. You wait here till my agent places that letter unopened in my hands, and you then allow me one clear half-hour to leave the house, after which you resume your own freedom of action and go where you please. Third condition, you give me the satisfaction of a gentleman for your intrusion into my private affairs, and for the language you have allowed yourself to use to me at this conference. The time and place, abroad, to be fixed in a letter from my hand when I am safe on the continent, and that letter to contain a strip of paper measuring accurately the length of my sword. Those are my terms. Inform me if you accept them. Yes or no. The extraordinary mixture of prompt decision, far-sighted cunning, and mountebank bravado in this speech staggered me for a moment, and only for a moment. The one question to consider was whether I was justified or not in possessing myself of the means of establishing Laura's identity at the cost of allowing the scoundrel who had robbed her of it to escape me with impunity. I knew that the motive of securing the just recognition of my wife in the birthplace from which she had been driven out as an impostor, and of publicly erasing the lie that still profaned her mother's tombstone, was far purer, in its freedom from all taint of evil passion, than the vindictive motive which had mingled itself with my purpose from the first. And yet I cannot honestly say that my own moral convictions were strong enough to decide the struggle in me by themselves. They were helped by my remembrance of Sir Percival's death. How awfully, at the last moment, had the working of the retribution there been snatched from my feeble hands. What right had I to decide, in my poor mortal ignorance of the future, that this man, too, must escape with impunity because he escaped me? I thought of these things, perhaps with the superstition inherent in my nature, perhaps with a sense worthier of me than superstition. It was hard, when I had fastened my hold on him at last, to loosen it again of my own accord, but I forced myself to make the sacrifice. In plainer words, I determined to be guided by the one higher motive of which I was certain, the motive of serving the cause of Laura and the cause of truth. I accept your conditions, I said, with one reservation on my part. What reservation may that be? He asked. It refers to the sealed letter, I answered. I require you to destroy it unopened in my presence as soon as it is placed in your hands. My object in making this stipulation was simply to prevent him from carrying away written evidence of the nature of my communication with Pesca. The fact of my communication he would necessarily discover when I gave the address to his agent in the morning. But he could make no use of it on his own unsupported testimony, even if he really ventured to try the experiment, which need excite in me the slightest apprehension on Pesca's account. I grant your reservation, he replied, after considering the question gravely for a minute or two. It is not worth dispute. The letter shall be destroyed when it comes into my hands. He rose, as he spoke, from the chair in which he had been sitting opposite to me up to this time. With one effort he appeared to free his mind from the whole pressure on it of the interview between us thus far. "Alf," he cried, stretching his arms luxuriously. The skirmish was hot while it lasted. "Take a seat, Mr. Hartright. We meet as mortal enemies hereafter. Let us, like gallant gentlemen, exchange polite attentions in the meantime. Permit me to take the liberty of calling for my wife." He unlocked and opened the door. "Eleanor," he called out in his deep voice. The lady of the viperish face came in. "Madame Fosco, Mr. Hartright," said the Count, introducing us with easy dignity. "My angel," he went on, addressing his wife, "will your labors of packing up allow you time to make me some nice strong coffee? I have writing business to transact with Mr. Hartright, and I require the full possession of my intelligence to do justice to myself." Madame Fosco bowed her head twice, once sternly to me, once submissively to her husband, and glided out of the room. The Count walked to a writing table near the window, opened his desk, and took from it several quires of paper and a bundle of quill pens. He scattered the pens about the table so that they might lie ready in all directions to be taken up when wanted, and then cut the paper into a heap of narrow slips of the form used by professional writers for the press. "I shall make this a remarkable document," he said, looking at me over his shoulder. "Habits of literary composition are perfectly familiar to me. One of the rarest of all the intellectual accomplishments that a man can possess is the grand faculty of arranging his ideas. Immense privilege. I possess it. Do you?" He marched backwards and forwards in the room until the coffee appeared, humming to himself, and marking the places at which obstacles occurred in the arrangement of his ideas by striking his forehead from time to time with the palm of his hand. The enormous audacity with which he seized on the situation in which I placed him, and made it the pedestal on which his vanity mounted for the one cherished purpose of self-display, mastered my astonishment by main force. Sincerely as I loathed the man, the prodigious strength of his character, even in its most trivial aspects, impressed me in spite of myself. The coffee was brought in by Madame Fosco. He kissed her hand in grateful acknowledgment and escorted her to the door, returned, poured out a cup of coffee for himself, and took it to the writing table. "May I offer you some coffee, Mr. Hartright?" he said before he sat down. I declined. "What? You think I shall poison you?" he said gaily. "The English intellect is sound, so far as it goes," he continued, seating himself at the table, "but it has one grave defect. It is always cautious in the wrong place." He dipped his pen in the ink, placed the first slip of paper before him with a thump of his hand on the desk, cleared his throat, and began. He wrote with great noise and rapidity, in so large and bold a hand, and with such wide spaces between the lines, that he reached the bottom of the slip in not more than 2 minutes certainly from the time when he started at the top. Each slip, as he finished it, was paged and tossed over his shoulder out of his way on the floor. When his first pen was worn out, that went over his shoulder too, and he pounced on a second from the supplies scattered about the table. Slip after slip, by dozens, by 50s, by hundreds, flew over his shoulders on either side of him till he had snowed himself up in paper all round his chair. Hour after hour passed, and there I sat watching, there he sat writing. He never stopped, except to sip his coffee, and when that was exhausted, to smack his forehead from time to time. 1 o'clock struck, 2, 3, 4, and still the slips flew about all round him. Still the untiring pen scraped its way ceaselessly from top to bottom of the page. Still the white chaos of paper rose higher and higher all round his chair. At 4 o'clock I heard a sudden splutter of the pen, indicative of the flourish with which he signed his name. "Bravo!" he cried, springing to his feet with the activity of a young man, and looking me straight in the face with a smile of superb triumph. "Done, Mr. Hartright," he announced with a self-renovating thump of his fist on his broad breast. "Done, to my own profound satisfaction, to your profound astonishment, when you read what I have written. The subject is exhausted. The man, Fosco, is not. I proceed to the arrangement of my slips, to the revision of my slips, to the reading of my slips, addressed emphatically to your private ear. For a clock has just struck. Good. Arrangement, revision, reading from 4 to 5. Short snooze of restoration for myself from 5 to 6. Final preparations from 6 to 7. Affair of agent and sealed letter from 7 to 8. At 8, en route. Behold the program." He sat down cross-legged on the floor among his papers, strung them together with a bodkin and a piece of string, revised them, wrote all the titles and honors by which he was personally distinguished at the head of the first page, and then read the manuscript to me with loud theatrical emphasis and profuse theatrical gesticulation. The reader will have an opportunity, ere long, of forming his own opinion of the document. It will be sufficient to mention here that it answered my purpose. He next wrote me the address of the person from whom he had hired the fly, and handed me Sir Percival's letter. It was dated from Hampshire on the 25th of July, and it announced the journey of Lady Glyde to London on the 26th. Thus, on the very day, the 25th, when the doctor's certificate declared that she had died in St. John's Wood, She was alive, by Sir Percival's own showing, at Blackwater, and, on the day after, she was to take a journey. When the proof of that journey was obtained from the flyman, the evidence would be complete. 5:15, said the Count, looking at his watch. Time for my restorative snooze. I personally resemble Napoleon the Great, as you may have remarked, Mr. Hartright. I also resemble that immortal man in my power of commanding sleep at will. Excuse me one moment. I will summon Madame Fosco, to keep you from feeling dull. Knowing as well as he did that he was summoning Madame Fosco to ensure my not leaving the house while he was asleep, I made no reply and occupied myself in tying up the papers which he had placed in my possession. The lady came in cool, pale, and venomous as ever. "Amuse Mr. Hartright, my angel," said the Count. He placed a chair for her, kissed her hand for the second time, withdrew to a sofa, and in 3 minutes was as peacefully and happily asleep as the most virtuous man in existence. Madame Fosco took a book from the table, sat down, and looked at me with the steady vindictive malice of a woman who never forgot and never forgave. "I have been listening to your conversation with my husband," she said. "If I had been in his place, I would have laid you dead on the hearth rug." With those words, she opened her book and never looked at me or spoke to me from that time till the time when her husband woke. He opened his eyes and rose from the sofa, accurately to an hour from the time when he had gone to sleep. "I feel infinitely refreshed," he remarked. "Eleanor, my good wife, are you already upstairs? That is well. My little packing here can be completed in 10 minutes. My traveling dress assumed in 10 minutes more. What remains before the agent comes?" He looked about the room and noticed the cage with his white mice in it. "Ah," he cried piteously, "a last laceration of my sympathies still remains. My innocent pets, my little cherished children, what am I to do with them? For the present we are settled nowhere. For the present we travel incessantly. The less baggage we carry the better for ourselves. My cockatoo, my canaries, and my little mice, who will cherish them when their good papa is gone?" He walked about the room deep in thought. He had not been at all troubled about writing his confession, but he was visibly perplexed and distressed about the far more important question of the disposal of his pets. After long consideration, he suddenly sat down again at the writing table. "An idea," he exclaimed. "I will offer my canaries and my cockatoo to this vast metropolis. My agent shall present them in my name to the Zoological Gardens of London. The document that describes them shall be drawn out on the spot." He began to write, repeating the words as they flowed from his pen. Number 1. Cockatoo of transcendent plumage, attraction, of himself, to all visitors of taste. Number 2. Canaries of unrivaled vivacity and intelligence, worthy of the Garden of Eden, worthy also of the garden in the Regent's Park. Homage to British zoology, offered by Fosco. The pen spluttered again, and the flourish was attached to his signature. "Count, you have not included the mice," said Madame Fosco. He left the table, took her hand, and placed it on his heart. "All human resolution, Eleanor," he said solemnly, "has its limits. My limits are inscribed on that document. I cannot part with my white mice. Bear with me, my angel, and remove them to their traveling cage upstairs." "Admirable tenderness," said Madame Fosco, admiring her husband, with a last viperish look in my direction. She took up the cage carefully and left the room. The Count looked at his watch. In spite of his resolute assumption of composure, he was getting anxious for the agent's arrival. The candles had long since been extinguished, and the sunlight of the new morning poured into the room. It was not till 5 minutes past 7 that the gate bell rang, and the agent made his appearance. He was a foreigner with a dark beard. "Mr. Hartright, Monsieur Rubel," said the Count, introducing us. He took the agent, a foreign spy, in every line of his face, if ever there was one yet, into a corner of the room, whispered some directions to him, and then left us together. Monsieur Rubel, as soon as we were alone, suggested with great politeness that I should favor him with his instructions. I wrote 2 lines to Pesca, authorizing him to deliver my sealed letter to the bearer, directed the note, and handed it to Monsieur Rubel. The agent waited with me till his employer returned, equipped in traveling costume. The Count examined the address of my letter before he dismissed the agent. "I thought so," he said, turning on me with a dark look and altering again in his manner from that moment. He completed his packing and then sat consulting a traveling map, making entries in his pocketbook, and looking every now and then impatiently at his watch. Not another word, addressed to myself, passed his lips. The near approach of the hour for his departure, and the proof he had seen of the communication established between Pesca and myself, had plainly recalled his whole attention to the measures that were necessary for securing his escape. A little before 8 o'clock, Monsieur Rubel came back with my unopened letter in his hand. The Count looked carefully at the superscription and the seal, lit a candle, and burnt the letter. "I perform my promise," he said, "but this matter, Mr. Hartright, shall not end here." The agent had kept at the door the cab in which he had returned. He and the maidservant now busied themselves in removing the luggage. Madame Fosco came downstairs, thickly veiled, with the traveling cage of the white mice in her hand. She neither spoke to me nor looked towards me. Her husband escorted her to the cab. "Follow me as far as the passage," he whispered in my ear. "I may want to speak to you at the last moment." I went out to the door, the agent standing below me in the front garden. The Count came back alone and drew me a few steps inside the passage. "Remember the third condition," he whispered. "You shall hear from me, Mr. Hartright. I may claim from you the satisfaction of a gentleman sooner than you think for." He caught my hand before I was aware of him, and wrung it hard, then turned to the door, stopped, and came back to me again. "One word more," he said confidentially. "When I last saw Miss Holcomb, she looked thin and ill. I am anxious about that admirable woman. Take care of her, sir. With my hand on my heart, I solemnly implore you, take care of Miss Holcomb." Those were the last words he said to me before he squeezed his huge body into the cab and drove off. The agent and I waited at the door a few moments looking after him. While we were standing together, a second cab appeared from a turning a little way down the road. It followed the direction previously taken by the Count's cab, and as it passed the house and the open garden gate, a person inside looked at us out of the window. The stranger at the opera again, the foreigner with a scar on his left cheek. "You wait here with me, sir, for half an hour more," said Monsieur Rubel. "I do." We returned to the sitting room. I was in no humor to speak to the agent, or to allow him to speak to me. I took out the papers which the Count had placed in my hands, and read the terrible story of the conspiracy told by the man who had planned and perpetrated it.